So
hmm
start recording. So hello
Yeah.
there. Thank you
Hi.
for joining me.
Yes, round
Uh,
two.
Round two. So you've been here before, and I will include
Yes.
a link to the first video. But for
Perfect.
those who haven't been here before, let's start with a brief introduction, like who
Yeah.
you are, what is your name, and what do you do in broad terms, and then we see what we do from there.
Yeah, perfect. So, hello there. My name is Eric. I am, I guess, a software developer and a musician, and I do some writing and different things. I kind of have my website, which you can see in my name here, mfred.com. That's kind of a hub for a lot of the different things I do with, music and writing programs and everything like that. I recently graduated from college with a degree in computer science, and then I went out to. I live in Minnesota now, but for a few months I went out to Ohio to work my first job in software development, and then a few months ago I came back home for the holidays, and am now looking for more work as a software developer, either remote or around the Minneapolis area. So I'm just kind of in kind of that in between period where I'm just kind of doing some self study and some kind of personal growth time and things like that, and doing fun things like talking to Prot here, and yeah, enjoying the warming Minnesota winter. It was very cold for a while. Now it's starting to warm up, but yeah, that's kind of a brief overview of what I'm doing now.
Very good, very good. And do you have any particular interest when it comes to programming? Like any area where you are more excited to work in?
Yeah, for sure. I really enjoy anything to do with programming languages, parsers, compilers, domain-specific languages, things like that. That's kind of my favorite discipline, functional programming generally. I like stuff like that. Obviously, that ties into Emacs and Emacs Lisp, which is the original reason I found out about Prot. And yeah, that's definitely my favorite kind of programming, but I guess I kind of consider myself a jack of all trades too, where I can do low-level stuff. I can do, you know, shell scripting. I can do web programming. I did all the front end for my website and everything like that, and the back end. So I did everything for my website. But yeah, I kind of like all types of programming, but any kind of thing to do with languages or functional programming is kind of my favorite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's cool. And
hmm
have you been involved in free software slash open source software?
Yeah, yeah. So I've kind of interacted with the. I have a couple commits in the Emacs master branch. They're just documentation fixes. They're not any kind of serious code commits. But I've interacted with the mailing list there, obviously to submit patches and stuff. Longtime Emacs user, and then I've also interacted a bit with the Git mailing list because I wanted to submit. I was trying to do a bug fix for this issue in Git Stash at one point. I didn't end up finishing it, but I want to circle back to that. Um, but yeah, so I've interacted a little bit with some different open source communities. Got a couple of commits in Emacs, but I want to do even more stuff going forward because open source software and the way the development works and the way the mailing lists work is something that's really fun for me.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine it's a different world than what you would get when you are a contractor or when you work for a company.
Yeah, it's totally different. And one of the things I like about it is that, so one of the things, and I've heard this from my friends who work in software development too, is one of the things about working in that kind of environment is there can be a lot of inefficiencies happening with kind of the way that like work is planned or the way that like meetings happen to where people are trying to figure out what they want to work about and work on. And sometimes there are these frameworks like with sprints and different goals and things like that, where it can feel like there's a lot of kind of management, detail, overhead, and things like that. One of the things I really like about the way that the open source projects work is that you submit patches to the mailing list, and then those get reviewed and everything. But no one's really going to look at anything that isn't that hasn't already been formulated to a high standard. It won't be taken seriously. So my point is that one of the thing I like the most about it is that discussion only happens, in-depth discussion only happens once serious work has taken place. And I think that makes it so much more efficient than a situation where people are scheduling meetings and trying to figure out what to work on. Not that that can't ever be useful, but I just kind of like the way that things are done in open source. And there was a moment, maybe it was around like a year ago at this point, where I emailed the Git mailing list, and I was like, "Hey, I'm kind of new to the open source." It was such a beginner type of email. I was like, "Hey, I'm kind of new to the community. Like, is there any like task I could work on?" I was almost like trying to treat it like a normal job. I'm like, "Hey, what can I work on? What's on the docket?" And the lead maintainer of Git, Junio C. Hamano, I think is his name. He basically sent me this email, which I didn't quite understand immediately, but he basically said the phrase he used was "scratch your own itch." And I had to think about it for a second. But what he meant is that what you should do instead of gaining a specific task from us, or instead of hearing about a specific task from us, what you should go off and do is just explore the software, see if there are any bugs that you can notice or want to try to fix, any test cases that you can improve, any feature you want to add. Go off, explore, and scratch your own itch by adding to the software what you would want to be there. Like if you could design the software, which you basically can do, right, since you have the source code, just add whatever you think needs to be there, and then if it works out, then send it to us and we'll review it. So I just kind of like that workflow. I like that kind of philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that also has the added advantage that because you care about it, so you're scratching your own itch, you also have an intuition of what it should look like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, you already are working towards something, and you need less of a guidance or a nudge to move in that direction. You are more self-driven.
Yeah. And I feel like that feeds back into an inherent desire to kind of be ambitious and to kind of do something which really kind of improves the software in an ambitious way. And that's one of the things I think also psychologically, at least for me, how it's different from working in more of a normal job environment is that sometimes, at least in the job that I was working on, I felt like if I were to try to conceptualize some kind of bigger improvement to the code base or something, it might kind of be rejected because people would think it might be a waste of time or something like that. I kind of like, obviously the circumstances are different, but in the open source world, it feels like there's kind of an inherent almost challenge to be ambitious and to do something really cool, and that at least that activates, for me personally, that activates my creativity and activates my ambition, and I feel like that just makes it a lot more fun.
Mm-hmm. And even when it's not solo, even when you want to work as a team, this idea of, well, bring a patch or generally bring some code and then we talk, I think
Yes. Yeah.
ultimately focuses the discussion as well. So it's not like, let's meet to discuss the possibility of future discussions and topics to be discussed. It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
here it is, let's see where that leads us.
Yeah. Exactly. And because I also think because it's a volunteer system, I think that there's an inherently no nonsense attitude kind of going on there, because sometimes when work is being paid for, when hours are being logged, and that's determining compensation and things like that, people have almost an incentive to do hours of work that aren't necessarily, they have an incentive to record the most hours of work, but not necessarily to do the most work. But in a volunteer situation, people are there because they want to be there, and that inherently is just they have a more streamlined mindset because they're just there of their own volition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Of course, that's good. Um, if you get to do more of that, of course, you will see that there is, you hinted at it already, but there is like a social aspect to it where it's like, well, I want to gain ambition, be more confident, that sort of thing, where it's not about software anymore. It's about character building, let's call it.
Yeah.
Where you develop a sense of how should I behave in the world? How should I
Yeah.
deal with other people? How should we manage a shared resource? And I think that's also a very nice part of the experience.
Yeah, and that's one thing I know. I was inspired by that too in my interactions with the Emacs development mailing list, for example. I noticed just the standard of quality in the communication, not the standard of writing, the standard of how people interacted with each other was just very high, and that was definitely really cool for me. That made me think, oh, I want to dig more into this. I want to become more of a part of this.
And yeah, of course, also the style of communication plays a part in it. Because if you reduce it to something that is really easy and really brief and really low effort, what happens is that first you lose the quality of communication, and what follows is the quality of the contributions, because
Yeah.
now nobody needs to put any real effort into it. And it sort of sets the expectations. Like if you send an email and you get a low effort contribution back, a low effort response,
Yeah.
already you feel, at least subconsciously, that you can get away with low effort contribution. But if the feedback you get is already of a high standard, you feel that, oh, I have to live up to this standard and even
Yeah.
surpass it.
Yeah, and I think there's also an idea going on there with the mailing list, since they're archived. The idea that whatever you're communicating, whatever you're sending to the mailing list, and the responses from maintainers that come back will be in the archive. So it's an idea of, we want to produce quality communication, because when we're answering a question, for example, that answer can be searched for by later people who might want to have that question answered. So we want to provide that high quality. It's essentially this ongoing documentation type of thing. Providing this repository of high quality information, which is just sort of emergently developing as new mails are sent and as they reference old mails and things like that. It's a really effective system, I think. I mean, there is sort of like almost like an archaic sort of nature to it, where people might think that, since it's a mailing list, or since the mailing list archive website looks like it's kind of old, like that might seem uninviting to some people. But once you dig into it, like it's very simple, and it's very usable, and it's very effective, I think.
And that's actually the community building part of it, which is like we are not just writing programs, we are not just writing lines of code, but code is the focus of a community of people. So ultimately, this community has to be a place that is conducive to writing that code. And I think
that, and I think you see that, like, to use Emacs as an example, I think you see that that kind of level of quality, or that level of like a camaraderie sort of leading to quality. I feel like you see that in the way that the manual is written, and just the way that Emacs itself is developed, the way the documentation is. Like, one of the things about using Emacs is I really love reading the manual, because I just think it's so well written, and it kind of has inspired me to try to write my documentation better for my personal programs and things like that. And I just really love that. It really makes you, for me as a user of Emacs, it makes me really, it has made me really stick with Emacs and continue to be excited to learn more about it, and to continue improving my workflow and things like that.
And on this note, there is this idea like good code speaks for itself. Like, you don't need to document it, which I think makes sense. But when you're building a community, having documentation and having code that is kind of self-explanatory, or at least easy to reason about if you don't quite get the code part, helps with bringing in newcomers. So it's basically like a community, a pro-social initiative. For example, when I started using Emacs, I didn't have any programming experience, let alone Lisp experience. And somehow I found my way to the source code of a function. And by reading the English and the comments and all that, eventually I was able to reason about it. I couldn't tell the finer points, but I was like, okay, I understand what this is about.
It's like you had a sense of like, this is comprehensible. Because the thing about Lisp is, due to the simplicity of the language, you can sort of like, I feel like it's a good first language. And I feel like I'm now remembering an anecdote that MIT used to teach Lisp in their intro programming class. It makes sense, because it's such a language that has really minimal syntax features in it. The language is super simple. It's basically just made out of lists, literally list processor. I feel like that makes it a good starting point for someone who's just trying to start reasoning about code and things like that. And I also love that about Emacs too, the idea that when you ask for documentation, there's this inherent, like, when you do Control-HF for show me a function, it like, there's I forget exactly where it is in the help buffer, but there's some place where if you press ret on it, like, it literally takes you to the function definition. I use that all the time. There's this idea, that's another thing I love about Emacs, the idea that it's kind of like holding your hand to go look at the code. It's like, go look at this, go check this out, go modify this. And of course, the fact that you can eval it to redefine it and then get new behavior right there on the fly, like, I feel like that makes it so, it has this inviting character to it, which I feel like makes it really user-friendly.
Exactly. So then there is this synergy between, okay, so this is free software in the sense that you have the freedom to use it and all the other freedoms to share it, etc. But also, it's readily available and invites you to be a part of the community, and thus, effectively, to you also contribute to the proliferation of such software, or at least to help others use it.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd compare it to, I just thought of this analogy. It's almost like I'm a really big coffee fan, so I like going to different coffee shops and trying their espresso and everything like that. Sometimes there's coffee shops where you just walk into them and you just get a really good feeling. And often that corresponds to the coffee being high quality. But there are some coffee shops where you just really want to go back to them just because of that kind of community feeling, or just because of that kind of really kind of just because of that layer of polish that's somehow just kind of in the air in terms of the way that people run this coffee shop and everything. I kind of compare Emacs and the Emacs community to that. It's like this feeling of, even if you only have a brief interaction where you just get one little latte or something, you are left with this positive sense of, even if you go on the mailing list to just read about one little thing, or even if you just make one little change or something, you are left with this feeling of friendliness that almost makes you want to return to that place. And that's why, even after the couple contributions I've done to Emacs, I'm still like, so excited to go back and try to do more contributions, because I was left with that good feeling, left with that friendly feeling.
Oh yeah, that's I like that. I like that image, and of course, it's exactly that. So if you have like a good environment, a good coffee shop, exactly. Even if you have one coffee, you have good memories, and then you're like, okay, looking forward to revisit you.
So in this analogy, you would be like the equivalent of like a master barista who's doing all kinds of fancy latte art with your theming package and everything like that.
Exactly.
I was going to ask, actually, on that subject, I had a question that I was thinking about asking you the other day when I was thinking about doing this meeting. I was going to ask, last time we met, we talked about your F themes and your Doric themes and your different theming packages, and you were talking about sort of considering the color harmony and the different types of color harmonies, and how that obviously needs to factor into your development of a visually appealing theme. I was going to ask you, how did you educate yourself about that different kind of visual design and color theory and things like that? Because that's something I'm personally interested in, and I'd be curious to hear about your journey in that process, because it's obviously had very good results.
Yeah, so maybe it's surprising, but I actually it was inspired by walking. So if you walk around and you pick, so for example, here in Cyprus, so I'm walking around and I am observing the landscapes, and I'm like, well, if I were to tell you, here are 5 colors, tell me which place this is. So I had this idea, where would you be able to do it? So it was like, if I give you an abstract representation of a place, can you actually see what the concrete version of that is? And then I was like, oh, look, like in this landscape, for example, the constant is the ochre color, the color of the soil, basically. It's the ochre which contrasts with the deep green color. And there are some hints of yellow, like very small hints of yellow, and then a blue sky, for example. So I'm like, okay, try to do that as a color scheme, and then see where that takes you, and then you have to adjust. So I start with that. And then little by little, I start understanding colors. Like if you start with the 3 primary colors in the computer, which is red, green, blue, and these are different, by the way, if you do painting by hand. So then it's a red, yellow, blue, I think. Yes, red, yellow, blue. But the point is, if you start with the 3 colors, they have inherent properties to them. Like the green is inherently brighter than the blue. And the red is in the middle of those. So once you combine each of those, so once you have pairs of those, so green and red gives you yellow. And so you take a very bright color with a medium bright color. What does that give you? Then you have red and blue. That gives you magenta. What does that mean in terms of luminance and so on?
So tying it back to programming, almost, there's a kind of algebra to the way that the colors work out.
Yes, for sure. And then the thing with algebra, of course, is that, and mathematics in general, is that, of course, it's in our head, in a sense, we are just making it up. But actually, it's all out there. Like 1 + 1 = 2, in a sense, that's abstract. In another sense, it is everywhere. So it is inherent, it's embedded in the very fabric of the cosmos. It's like in the nature of things.
Right, because, for example, if you had 2 stones, you could think of 1 and 2 as words that describe quantities. If you put 2 stones together, you literally have 2 stones. Like it is somehow within the nature of reality. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And for example, something which may be a little bit more advanced to somebody who doesn't know programming. For example, you mentioned algorithm, right? And you're like, oh, no, that's what programmers do. I have no idea. And then you're like, have you ever prepared the coffee?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, there is
Yeah.
step 1, step 2, step 3. That's already an algorithm. Can you?
Yeah, and there have been times, because I was a TA in college for programming, there are times where I would be explaining programming concepts to people who were new to it, and I would always kind of describe that with the kind of with the frame of them, with the frame being that they already understand these concepts, they just need an analogy. So, for example, like um, if you are running your oven to bake something and it's on a timer and the oven goes off when the timer stops, that's a loop that's running with an exit condition, right? The oven stops when the timer hits 0. So I like describing programming concepts to people that way because they already understand the abstract nature of these systems of logic and everything. They just need to kind of see how that maps onto the kind of the text of the code on the page.
Correct. And what you just described works in nature as well. For example, if there is water flowing from a certain spot that there was no water before, now what happens is that the grass will grow where the water flows. Once grass grows close to the water, then there is more humidity there, so more grass will grow further away from the water. And then there are exactly these same feedback loops where, so if the water stops flowing, then the grass disappears and that kind of thing. So you may think of that as a life cycle, but you can also think of it in terms of loops of cause and effect, which can also be described as loops of communication signals. Hey, this
Yeah,
happened, therefore do
yeah.
that.
Yeah, exactly. So just to return to your point for a second, so you were talking about how you were
The
perceiving
colors, yeah.
these colors in your natural environments, and you were kind of thinking about how to distill certain environments into almost a visual signature or chromatic signature that describes that environment. And then I'm guessing next you started to try to implement color schemes based on those ideas and kind of explore that process and see how it worked out.
Yeah. So the idea is first, what I wanted to do is answer the question of, is there a common in the multitude? So I am observing a landscape of the mountains of Cyprus. If I were to tell you in few words or in few colors, what is the common in the multitude here? What can I do to the same I would do if I were to talk about a theory? So I will observe a lot of phenomena and come up with a theory that describes all of them. So basically the same. What is the common in the multitude? And then it
The
was
heart of the
really
landscape, essentially, right?
exactly. And then
Yeah.
that effectively bled into coding. So let's do that in the text editor that I was using, and let's see how that looks. And little by little, I learned a lot.
And have you read formal descriptions or formal things about color theory or things like that, or has it been mostly your own exploration?
It's mostly by experience, and then I have read a few things, but not much. It's all based on what I have observed and what I have experienced, and then playing around and seeing what works in practice. Like, for example, you can have different color harmonies, such as a color harmony where you combine magenta, cyan, and yellow. So what you are doing
But
there,
meaning mix them or put them next to each other?
next to each other in that
Okay,
case.
yeah.
Of course, you will have to control for the relative luminance. So assuming they have like something where one doesn't really pop out and the other is really deep, but
Yeah,
basically similar levels of luminance, like these go well together because they contrast well. And they contrast well because, for example, yellow is a combination of green and red, whereas cyan is a combination of green and blue. So cyan doesn't have red, and it means that it will never look similar to yellow.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. And so by putting them side by side, you have three colors that complement each other. So they work together, but they are also different than each other. So that's one of many harmonies that you can have. And this is a harmony that if you already think of the three colors as a triangle, and then their three colors as the other triangle, so now you have 6 points, right? each triangle is a color harmony already of
Yeah.
complement of colors like that work together. And then you
Yeah.
can have colors on opposite ends. So, for example, blue with yellow, that's a very common combination. Like if you look at the
Yeah.
posters, for example, of movies, it's very common to
Mm-hmm.
see bluish colors with orange. If you observe it, like
Mm.
a dark, cool kind of blue with a
Mm-hmm.
bright, warm orange. Like it's really common.
Mm. Yeah. So of course now as you're talking about harmony, I can't help but think of musical harmony, which is sort of I guess it's my equivalent to kind of your exploration of color, my exploration of, I've been playing piano for about 10 years at this point. I recently started playing guitar as well, and I also do music composition, production, things like that. There is a deep, and my focus in my main interest in music, performance and composition has always been harmony. That's always been what I've been most attracted to. And there's kind of an analogy there between how mixing certain colors or setting certain colors next to each other, there's this whole language of the effects that it can have, and of kind of the ways that you can develop preferences and then kind of compose those into a piece of art, essentially. That same pattern occurs exactly within music. Like, for example, if I take the note C and I mix it, or I play at the same time the note G, I get a very open sound. We call that in music a perfect fifth, the interval between those two pitches in the 12-tone equal tempered system. So if I have a C singing out on a violin or a guitar or anything, doesn't matter, voice, and then I have a G next to it, I get this very open, clear, kind of translucent sound. It sounds very stable. You could build more harmony on top of it. But for example, if I have the note C and then I have the note B, kind of right below the C, an octave up, then I would create an interval called a major seventh, and that would have it has a much more dissonant sound to it, which means the ratio between the pitches, the frequencies, is more complex. The perfect fifth ratio is 3-2, which is a simple ratio, but the ratio of, I forget what a major seventh is in our system, but it's going to be like, it's going to be like 53/27 or something like that. It's a much more, your ear hears it as much more kind of spiky and much more dissonant. But that dissonance has its own kind of color, has its own kind of tone color, which can have an emotional resonance. Like, for example, in my personal playing, like you would find on some recordings on my website, I use major seventh chords a lot like that. For example, I might have a C and a B, and then I might put an E on top of it to create this sort of, the E, the major third against the C, creates a much warmer sound, kind of like that orange that you were talking about. Against the cool dissonance of the major seventh, it creates this beautiful simultaneity of warmth, and it creates this beautiful simultaneity of like warmth and richness, a juxtaposed, but in the same simultaneous moment. That's what's so cool about musical harmony. Juxtaposed with this sort of unstable, kind of bright, unstable, dissonant kind of sound of the major seventh, and that creates this amazing chord, which in jazz theory you would just call a major seventh chord. And there are many different chords of that variety. You can do the algebra, moving the notes around in any different way, creating so many combinations. And one of the things I love is that as you play an instrument or as you experiment with colors, you develop, you kind of, as you experiment with different sounds, almost like trying many different kinds of foods and flavors, you develop your personal palate, and you develop your personal taste, and you develop a sense of the harmony which feels most exciting, or which feels most true to you in a sense, and that can sort of inform your style as an artist. So yeah, that's just that came to mind when you were talking about color harmony, and how I think for you, I'm guessing it ties intellectually and emotionally into your relationship with your surrounding nature. For me, music also kind of ties into my relationship with sort of like the sounds of nature, and sort of how I experience the world through sound. I would consider myself a very auditory person at this point. But yeah, I'd be curious for your further thoughts on that and how it relates to your understanding of things.
I think if we were to take a step back and abstract
Hmm.
away the particularities, we would be saying the same things, because
Yeah.
fundamentally, you can think of visual stimuli as stimuli that affect the ear, because
Hmm.
there is intense, there is subtle, there is
Yeah.
a color that is prolonged, there is a color that is short, there is
Hmm.
plentiful, there is scarce. And so
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
can think in terms of pitches, you can think in terms of tonality, you can think, basically, you can make the same kind of harmonies in a more abstract sense.
Hmm.
And that's why there are many harmonies as well. whether we're talking visually or in terms of music, it's not just there is one harmony and you just follow that. So you can have harmony where things are close to each other. Like, for example, to talk in terms of color, like a gradient of green. Like you have a deep green leading to a brighter green. But you can just as well have a harmony of contrasting colors, like a green with a purple kind of color. Of course, specific shades that work together, but you can have that as well. So it's not that one is more harmonious than the other, is what are you trying to communicate, and what kind of emotion ultimately are you trying to elicit? What kind of response do you want to get?
And this reminds me, and what you were saying about taking inspiration reminds me of a quote from one of my favorite musical composers, Arnold Schoenberg, which I think he leads off his Theory of Harmony textbook with, where he says that he makes an attempt at defining art, and he says that art is an imitation of nature, and in its sort of more primitive form, art is just maybe a direct imitation of nature, like a direct landscape painting or whatever. But you can also think of art going to more abstract levels as being imitations of the nature of things. And so one of the things about I think trying to create art type things like color schemes or music pieces or things like that is that you can use sounds or colors or things from the natural world as sort of case studies, almost like pieces of art that emerge naturally through nature, and they can often be very instructive with providing inspiration. Like, for example, I recently did a piece of music called Flying Home, which is based on manipulating these different recordings of bird calls, these different public domain recordings of bird calls, and playing them back at different audio rates, like at double speed or half speed or normal speed, to create these sort of harmonies or these chords, this sort of impossible, time warped magic garden of birds that are all around your head singing at different pitches. And then there's also piano in the mix and things like that. The idea of creating this impossible space is very attractive to me. But I'm also thinking about, for example, your color schemes that are based on fruits. Like, for example, F orange, one of the recent ones, is based on the colors within an orange. And it has a very inherently pleasing, in my opinion, effect, just because of I think there's something to be said for using naturally occurring objects or landscapes as case studies, because that ties into our experience of what we find beautiful, because those are the environments that we've been perceiving for our whole life.
Correct. And back to the point of beauty is, think of looking at a landscape. For example, there is a pond or a lake where you are, and maybe there are some ducks, and you can hear the birds, and there are a few trees, and in the distance there is a mountain range, and maybe there are some clouds, that sort of thing, right?
And maybe you're feeling the breeze.
Exactly.
Complete multimodal experience.
Exactly. And it gives you a sense of peace, and you say, oh, this is beautiful. But you can also go to a place that is really intense. For example, you can go and stand at a precipice. And of course, it's dangerous, right? And you can see the rocks below, and you're like, oh my goodness, this is where it all ends. And at the base of it, you see a river. And in the distance, you see a dense forest or whatever. And that's also beautiful, but that's not as peaceful anymore. Or you can, if you have ever been at sea, I don't know if you've ever done that, but at sea, when there is a storm and now there are waves and they are hitting you, and you are not sure what is going to happen, you don't see anything in the distance, it's all dark around, and it's raining heavily, and that's also beautiful, because you are like, wow, look at this. Even though it's intense, there is a sense in which I admire it. So that's the experience of awe. So awe is when you admire, but also are afraid, in a sense, of something. And awe also engenders in us a feeling of, wow, this is beautiful. Of course, it's also scary.
Yeah, the closest probably I've ever been to that experience was when I went kayaking on Lake Superior, which is a kind of a massive cold water, freshwater lake in northern Minnesota. Also goes into other states. But I went kayaking one day, and it was a kind of choppy water that day. And the thing about being in a kayak, which is sort of like it's sort of like a more streamlined version of a canoe almost, but like you're sitting there very close to the water, kind of paddling. You just get the sense of like being completely at the mercy of the movement of the water, and you get a sense of the enormity of the water and its power and its kind of power over you. Like, of course, we were equipped with safety, flotation vests and things like that, but still, if a big wave comes in or if you somehow capsize or something, you could obviously be in a world of trouble. So like, yeah, I do a lot of one of my key inspirations throughout my life has been water, the sound of water, the flowing nature and the feeling of it and things like that. Like I've always loved fountains and things like that. And yeah, I think it's amazing how that pattern of flowing of fluid motion of water, for example, can be expressed in the most peaceful way in like a little lake or a river in a garden or something. But it can also be expressed in the most amplified, the most grandiose possible way. If you look at a storm in the ocean or something, it's amazing that talking about gradients and talking about different kinds of kind of turning the dials up or down in experience, which I think is one of the things artists try to do. I want this to be more intense. I want this to be more subtle. We also have that pattern to learn from in nature, where nature contains the most simple things and the most peaceful things. It also contains the most enormous and the most kind of grandiose possible things, in a sense.
And if you continue with the analogy of nature, which you then want to apply to art, if you think of the intensity of nature and put it in terms of our own ability to cope with it, you're like, well, I can cope with these waves for a little bit, but not for too long, right? And I think that is a little bit like what we do with art. Like if you give me all the intense colors or all the high-pitched sounds all at once, that overwhelms me. Like I cannot live in that world. But if you give them in smaller doses or in a more controlled way, then I'm like, we can reach those heights or we can experience that intensity, but in a manner that is sustainable. And it works for nature, it works for art.
Yeah, exactly. And continuing with the analogy even further, people can the more time they spend in those kind of environments, they can just sort of develop an expertise or a sort of sense of navigation to where they can actually feel more comfortable in that environment. Like for example, I over the past few years, I've gotten into more like intense, kind of like harsh, like noise-based music, like with using electronic kind of noise textures and things like that. And originally, when I first heard it, it just sounded like noise to me. But then, as I kept listening deeper, I kept hearing subtleties, and I kept getting more and more like engaged in it. And now I feel like that those kind of it's the equivalent of like a journey to a harsh landscape. It's the equivalent of going to hike through the high mountains or something, where you're kind of in this like environment that's kind of it's very intense. It might be very overwhelming, but as you learn to get comfortable in that place, you can learn things which you wouldn't be able to learn elsewhere. And then once you go back home to a more comfortable environment, you can almost kind of bring that memory or bring that experience of the intensity back with you to sort of kind of more fully inform your perception of nature and your perception of the contrasts and things like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And this is also why it makes sense to go in depth in experiences in general, not just
Yeah.
in breadth or let me experience as much as possible kind of thing. Where it's like, if you experience only as much as possible, you experience it superficially. What's the expression? A mile long and I don't know, an inch
A
deep.
mile long and an inch deep. Yeah.
Whereas if you go a bit deeper, you get to see what you otherwise, or to experience what you otherwise wouldn't have experienced, which is exactly these nuances. Because now you get accustomed to that world and you see the finer points. Whereas before you just see the first impression of it. It's a little bit like when you wake up from 10 hours of sleep and it's very dark in your room and you open the window and you don't see anything. It's very bright. And you're like, oh no, this is just a flash of light. But then if you give it some time, you start observing all the patterns. So it's a little bit like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And for me, it's really amazing. Like the more you explore the world, how fundamentally there is consistency. Like we can pick any subject. We could be talking about music or about cooking or about programming. And if we abstract away a little bit of the specifics, effectively we are always saying the same things. Like I can have a discussion about cooking, which ultimately applies to what you do with music. And From
Yeah.
there, we can take it and talk about sport, and that would still apply if we
Yeah.
abstract away the details.
Yeah. And I feel like those resonances or those similarities kind of expose like when you start to perceive them, it starts to sort of furnish your understanding of like kind of like the kind of core aspects of our experience and the core aspects of our psyche, like how we experience reality, how we create patterns, because our brains are kind of like pattern recognition machines in a sense. So conversation is this amazing tool where we can kind of talk about um, disparate experiences and we can develop connections between them, and then we gain so much understanding of like ourselves and of the other person, and of course that generalizes to so many different things. So yeah, that journey of going to understand more and more is so exciting.
Correct. And then what happens is that, for example, a language is how we can communicate ideas with each other. But language, as we said earlier with the examples, is like an if-else kind of statement where it's again a
Mm.
feedback loop. And
Mm.
what happens is, after a while, if you are paying attention to one area, that's what I was trying to say earlier. If you are paying close attention to one area of life,
Mm.
then you can effectively learn about other areas of life faster or easier
Yeah.
because you have understood the mechanics of
Yeah.
that you are focused in, and then you are confident in those applying elsewhere because of the consistency of the world. Of
Yeah.
course, applying with what the Latins say, mutatis mutandis. So while changing the things that need to be changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think colloquially, people might call that like kind of learning how to learn or learning. And sometimes with my musician friends, we talk about like learning how to practice and kind of those patterns of like, doing doing focused practice on a particular passage of music or doing many repetitions of a certain thing, and then spending only so much time on that, and then moving over to a more general view of the piece as a whole. Like things like that could apply to literally anything. They could apply to carpentry or programming or any kind of thing like that. And yeah, I love that. What you brought up there about the fact of the underlying consistency of the world, like that's something that obviously is it's like the deepest property of our reality. Obviously we kind of take it for granted, but it is this kind of like beautiful ground which all things stand on and which things can be arranged on top of. And it's kind of fundamental, I think, to like it makes you wonder, like, could the world be any other way? Like, could things be any other way? Is this how they have to be?
Yeah, it's of course an interesting question. And the
Mhm.
answer is we don't know unless we experience it fundamentally. But this
Yeah.
consistency also has another aspect to it, which goes to this, what you mentioned earlier, like this ambition or this sense of, well, I want to try things, I want to learn things. Because fundamentally, it gives you a sense that, well, if I go deep enough, then there are skills that I can carry with me and take with me and apply elsewhere. It's not like
Hmm.
I start from scratch and therefore I
Mm.
cannot possibly keep up with everything because there's just so much to learn.
Right.
But there is a sense where, for example, let me be concrete here. Like I
Hmm.
learned how to program and I learned
Hmm.
how to make contributions to free software and stuff. But this
Hmm.
now inspires me to think in terms of how can I solve other problems which apply to the physical world. And eventually I'm like, well, how can I make my life in the mountains here work?
Hmm.
So now I have a prior experience in the world of programming, which applies to the world of building a place to stay and then planting trees and then maintaining the land in a good condition and dealing with soil erosion and controlling for floods, etc., which
Yeah.
ultimately is a programming problem in the sense
Mm.
of, well, have you considered those edge cases, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
In real world, in the physical world. And if
Yeah.
you have confidence in your skills in one area, then what I'm saying is you can have them in other areas as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and I like that too, because as you go deep, let's say you go deep within one area, not only do you sort of cache these patterns and these kind of units of understanding that allow you to progress more quickly in other areas, but also like there's this thing which happens, which is as you go deeper and you sort of find more rarefied materials, you can sort of use those to make new tools, which allow you to go deeper still. It would be the equivalent of like, you're mining, and you originally mine, and you're just mining with stone tools or whatever you find. You could almost think of it as an analogy with Minecraft, where like you're originally using stone tools, and then you find some iron, and then you can make an iron pickaxe and go even deeper. Like there are certain things where, and you see this with the progression of, like, I see it in the progression of music composition, like European music composition across the 19th and 20th century, for example, which is something I kind of know a lot about. Like as new kind of systems of musical composition and structure were developed, they enabled people to work within those systems to kind of dig deeper into more and more kind of rich and more kind of mystifying and strange little internal worlds. And like I think that's so interesting, right? That's one thing that's so exciting about.
1 second. So let's
Yes,
put
yes.
a full stop there, because I have to open the door to the puppies. They are playing there with.
Yes, yeah. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
1 second. Let me do this, and then we continue, because this is fascinating. 1 second.
Please go ahead. Take your time.
Πάμε έξω. Πάμε. Άντε, έλα, μην. Sorry about this.
No worries. That was a great little intermission. I enjoyed that.
Yeah. So usually this is the hour where we go for our night walk. And of course they get excited. They don't think in terms of, oh, you have a meeting? What is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's go for our adventure. But yeah, back to what you were saying. It's exactly this, where you have developed the structures, the tools, and also the prior art, as it were, to build on. And then what happens is you are effectively mapping the terrain. And because you have to think of music in this case, as the equivalent of a landscape, and that's why we also use the metaphor of a soundscape, right? So
yeah, exactly.
You have to think of in terms of, well, we have sort of a general idea, but then of course we can go and explore further and see the finer points and continue with the details and see where those lead us. And then there are experiences to be had there. And for me, that's really impressive how it works. And then what also happens is that what you said now, it also inspires doing the alternative, which is like, well, you went down that path, I will go down a different path and see what I can find. So I will explore something completely different than what you are doing. Yeah. And for me, that's also fascinating. I don't know enough about music to give examples, but I'm sure that works. For example, in painting, where I have read a bit more, you will have a tradition that is more realist, right? It tries to represent things as they look. And then somebody's like, well, why should it be realistic? Why can't it not be an impression of it? So you have an impressionist movement. And then somebody's like, well, why should it be an impression and not be an abstraction? And so then you have abstract art and so on. But then from the abstractions, somebody might as well say, well, I am bored of this. What if we do something realistic? So it works that way as well.
And at the beginning of each of those movements in visual art that you mentioned, there was controversy where people needed time, like the sort of public needed time to sort of think about and sort of sink their teeth into this new aesthetic. Because, for example, with Impressionism, like it was kind of a revolutionary aesthetic, and people were originally, like many people in the public weren't really on board with that. They thought it was kind of a degradation of the previous tradition of art. But then and I kind of think of artists that way, in a sense, like kind of mapping out new territory, like one of their jobs of the way they function within society. Because since artists exist, they must, in a sense, be survivable, or they must contribute to the survival of the human species, or else they would have probably been phased out. I think one of the ways that artists make one of the things that artists contribute is that they kind of map out these strange places where originally someone might think, well, I don't really want to go there because it kind of looks weird. I'm not used to that. But then as they become more familiar with it, or as they kind of read the map a bit more, they see, oh, there might be things here which I can actually really appreciate, which might be able to add beauty to my life or add utility to my life in various ways. And I think that's you see this pattern. As usual, you see this pattern like at all levels, all around you, where like, for example, you think about the development of machines and how that went into the development of like, electricity, and then now computers that we have, and that developing an entire new language. Like obviously programming stands on top of that sort of mountain of layers. And so you just think of the fruits of exploration are so all encompassing all around us, and like we're constantly using those tools. And it's just so interesting to think about kind of the line of where we've gone to with our explorative nature at the core of the human. At the core of the human is this sort of explorative nature, and that has we've developed this kind of like massive city around us. You could think of it as of the fruits of exploration, and then where it's fascinating to think of where that line would extrapolate to in terms of where we can go next.
And on the point of the artist being the explorer, you can think of people, simplifying of course, but you can think of people being on a spectrum in terms of their behavior, from where at the one extreme they want to preserve what they have, and at the other extreme they want to discover something that they don't know. And
which may involve jeopardizing things you currently have, right? It's almost a game theory type of thing.
Which of course could mean your own undoing, if you think of it in terms of an explorer. Like, I board the ship and I go to the ocean and I embark on this journey. I have no idea what I will find. Maybe there are dragons out there. Maybe I will just find some distant land with some exotic fruits. I have no idea, unless I go there. So, but the same is true for artists. So there will be artists on this spectrum of, let's say, preservation and exploration, where you will have those that exactly will be the avant-garde, right? So they will be at the forefront trying to discover new things. And then, of course, in a sense, we cannot all be there, because then that is not viable. So there will always be a few who are the forerunners. And in a sense, they are weird because they are doing something that not everybody is doing.
Right, exactly.
But weird in a good way here, not in a judgmental way, in the sense that they do that which is not ordinary. And of course, that's one kind of artistic expression. And then at the other extreme is art, which is recreational. It recreates that which we already have. And there is, of course, inherent value to that as well.
Yeah, with like reinforcing cultural understanding, or with creating sort of signifiers that people can subscribe to and that people can talk in terms of. Like, I think about religion as kind of one expression of that, right? It's kind of the system. I almost think of religions as works of art in a sense, where they might have text, they might have key symbols, key signifiers that are used within that religion, and they kind of have a social cohesion effect, where when people start to kind of subscribe to those, or when people start to kind of use them, kind of bring those into their minds, bring them into their lives, like that can create it's almost like a campfire that people can gather around to a certain extent. And I think that's another utility that art can have, is the idea of a compelling story. Not only can it encode useful understanding, but it can also be a common ground where people who know that story can use it to sort of be socially cohesive, and can use that to then communicate.
Yeah, I think this is exactly how it is, because if you think of religion as a group of theological propositions that should be just talked about, then you are missing the point of religiosity. Like, if you see the fact that every society that has ever existed has had religiosity, so some kind of religious experience, then you're like, okay, what is the common in the multitude here? Like, what is it that we can see that exists throughout the millennia, everywhere, no matter the specific theological propositions? Or maybe they don't even have a theology. They can be religions without a God even. And then you're like, okay, what is it? And ultimately it's this. It's the narrative, art, and then, of course, the community aspect of that, what it means in just people hanging out together and people understanding each other. And then that inspiring us to collaborate and to do things. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's really amazing.
Yeah. And religions, this is interesting too. Religions themselves, or systems of ideas, let's say, they evolve in the same way that other organisms evolve, where they evolve to sort of be survivable. So, for example, one thing I think of is that in some religions, there's an idea of like an underworld that someone might go to if they live a bad life. And you could think of that as a kind of feature within the religion that kind of promotes social flourishing by encouraging people to do the right thing instead of the wrong thing. But also, you could think of it. I almost, to some extent, think of it like like spikes on a porcupine, for example, that makes it harder to attack. Like if there's this idea in a religion, for example, that people who don't believe in the religion or who reject it might gain some or might get some kind of extremely frightening punishment. That's almost like the spikes on a porcupine, to where it makes that religion harder to, that organism of that system of ideas has grown this feature onto it, which makes it harder to attack. And that's another interesting thing, is these ideas develop to be survivable as well.
Correct. And part of survivability is, if you also think in terms of organisms like people or animals, is to be able to adapt or to be able to go places. And the way that would work with ideas is, well, to propagate the idea. So an idea
Yeah.
that you tell me about, like a story you tell me about, if it's a
Hmm.
compelling story, I will go tell my friends, hey, Eric told me this. Such an amazing
Yeah.
story. But if you tell me
Hmm.
something that is extremely dull, I'm like, okay, who cares? I won't tell my friends about it. So
Yeah.
an idea
Hmm.
that is a compelling idea ultimately survivable, because also it can go places
Yeah.
and it can thrive in different environments in that regard.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because there's something about things that are memorable
Hmm hmm
that sort of elucidates a part of the nature of our minds and what we find most memorable. It kind of best fits the contour of your psyche to some extent. Like in music, we talk about melodies being catchy. Well, what does it mean when a melody is catchy? It means it's very memorable to you, and it means it sort of fits nicely within your brain. It kind of lodges in your brain like an earworm. We talk about that, and you could also think about stories being memorable, and then you could think about how the stories that we have, the stories that have been most preserved through time, are kind of the most memorable stories and things like that. And then you could think of them as being kind of the most useful stories in a way, or at least there being something very useful about them.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's why myth is at the center of the
Mm.
experience. There is
Hmm.
this modern phrase where it's like, oh, let's do myth busting. Where, of course, you understand what they are trying to say. Let's speak facts. Let's
Yeah.
talk about the facts, which of course is interesting. But if I give you a report from the Ministry of Financial Affairs with all the facts, you won't
Hmm.
remember anything after 5 minutes.
Right.
If I describe a myth, if I tell you a story, you will remember it for the rest of your life.
Hmm.
So a good story, a good myth in this case, is one that encodes or encapsulates messages that, of course, they are not just interesting, they are useful.
Hmm.
It's stories
Hmm.
that are relatable and stories that are metaphors for things that are happening out there.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of connecting the dots.
Hmm.
And so when you
Yeah.
think of a myth, you think of basically ancient technology,
Hmm.
which is like, let's compress a worldview into a story
Mm.
and
Yeah.
let's share that. And that
Hmm.
will survive.
Hmm.
And people will never forget about it. And ultimately, it's these stories slash myths slash narratives that compel us into action and inspire us. And it's a little
Hmm.
bit like a catchy tune. You'll never forget about it.
Yeah. And it's that same idea too, which you mentioned before, of not having to start from scratch, because you already have this understanding that has been already kind of refined, and that you can sort of take in as this more refined kind of version of kind of gaining the understanding quickly, like a shortcut. This is reminding me too of how things that are highly memorable, or things that catch our attention, can also be used sort of as a tool for misinformation as well, and for people to kind of spread their own uh, spread their own things or to try to exploit people by getting them to buy products or things like that. Like you sort of have to be careful. Maybe that's one of the ideas of like myth busting too, is like the idea of, we want to clear away the cobwebs. Essentially, we want to clear away the junk and clean up our space and things like that. And of course, that opens up a conversation about, well, what exactly should be attacked and what exactly should be supported and things like that. Obviously, that's an ongoing conversation. But like, I also think of that. What you're saying kind of reminds me tangentially of like, in the age of like AI generated content at this point, you can see like there are these different things I've seen on the internet where it's like a little AI generated song or something, and it can like basically people have these tools of mechanizing the creation of songs or of little memorable catchy things that they can use for their own purposes, and those purposes might not be good overall. So that's another thing why you have to be careful about being on the internet nowadays.
Correct. Though we already discussed the survivability of things and the viability of things, which
Hmm.
works for ideas, the way it works for art, the way it works for
Hmm.
experiences in
Yeah.
nature. And
Hmm.
if you think of an urban myth, as we say nowadays, like some
Urban legend. Yeah, yeah.
urban legend, is something that is completely wrong, something that is a falsehood, but which
Hmm.
sells well.
Hmm.
Ultimately, that cannot be selling well for too long. So maybe it's a fad, maybe it's something that works short term,
Hmm.
but whether it
Right.
will stand the test of time remains to be seen.
Hmm.
And basically, the idea is that it will not stand the test of time if it is not viable biologically. It will not be viable intellectually either. Like
Hmm.
if there is this idea that, I don't know, if you drink a certain potion, you have the elixir for youth and you will live
Hmm.
forever. And then
Hmm.
you drink that and you die. Well, at some point we will understand that this is nonsense and we will stop doing it, even if there is like a trend of everybody drinking this potion nowadays.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
So,
Now it is comforting to realize that the junk will eventually kind of fall off at some point, and kind of only the most useful things will survive.
because you see the connection between biological viability
Hmm.
and the intellectual viability. So if something doesn't work in terms of biology, it will eventually not work in terms of ideas as well. Of course, then
Hmm.
you get into areas where it's not clear, like when we are talking about things that are partially true or are
Hmm.
true in certain cases, or
Right.
if you have made some preparatory work and that sort of thing, where then it gets, of course, much more tricky. And then it's
Hmm.
also what you said with AI, which is, okay, so if you have people who are generating their own patterns and then their own things, or who are using machines for that, then what are the
Hmm.
implications of that in terms of
Hmm.
truth or in terms of viability? And I think
Hmm.
that's an open question ultimately.
Hmm. Yeah. This whole conversation about myths and everything is reminding me. I know I've heard you talk at different points about Greek myths and Greek traditions and things like that. I wonder, was that ever considered like a religion proper, or was that more just considered a system of myths and kind of different passed down knowledge and things like that?
So the Greek religion is separate from the Greek mythology.
Okay.
So the
Okay.
Greek mythology, for example, Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, so the two
Hmm.
epics. Homer is a poet. He's not like a priest, the equivalent of a
Hmm.
teacher of the
Hmm.
religion. But he uses the heroes and the gods in a way that tell a story. So the gods
Hmm.
are kind of the superheroes of that era, right? So
Yeah.
today we will say, okay, it's the X-Men, but back then it's like, oh, this is the Olympic gods kind of thing. And they are
Hmm.
doing these amazing things, but they have frailties of character and they are not perfect. And there is this
Hmm.
back and forth. So ultimately, it has kind of a religious undertone to it, but in practice, it's not religion proper. So
Hmm.
the Greek religion itself is not mythology. But then, of course, because it is lost in time, these distinctions are kind of blurred. And
Hmm.
you read poetry and you're like, okay, this was their religion, whereas it's not exactly like that. But
Mm-hmm.
the religion in the ancient Greek world wasn't uniform either, because
Yeah.
the ancient Greek world wasn't politically uniform. It was a patchwork of independent city-states, often
Mm.
at war with each other. And
Mm-hmm.
in one place, they would have certain beliefs about, I don't know, here we have bears and bears are sacred or whatever. In another
Mm-hmm.
place, they would be like, you know what, we are fishermen here. We have no idea what the bears are doing. So we
Mm-hmm.
just care about the sea, and we are sailors, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So would it be accurate then to say that the Greek gods that we talk about nowadays, like Poseidon and Zeus and things like that, would it be accurate to say that those gods were never formally worshipped, where they only kind of passed around through stories and in this sort of superhero way, or were there groups of people that we know about who actually did treat those as their primary gods?
So they would be worshipped as well,
Okay.
but you can think of it in terms of what is also happening nowadays. For example, there is Santa Claus, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
Saint Nicholas, right? So there is an
Mm.
actual Saint Nicholas that people believe in the sanctity of, right?
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's a real saint in the religion. But
Mm-hmm.
Santa Claus, even though it's the same character, right, isn't really a religious figure, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's this benevolent grandfather who brings toys to all the kids and stuff, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
he's using these reindeer, and they fly in the sky, and they
Mm-hmm.
have all these things, and there
Mm-hmm.
is the tree, and the tree has all these fancy lights on it, blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
The character is a religious figure, but ultimately the story has nothing to do with the religion. Like, nobody really says that, oh, this is Saint Nicholas, the same Saint Nicholas that we care about when we do our Christian rites and so on, right? So I think it's a
Exactly.
little bit like that, where there is Zeus, and then there is, or Poseidon, or whomever, and then there is Zeus the character, in the myths.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. Okay. And it's interesting too because you could think of it as people kind of worshiping Santa Claus when they do things like, leave out cookies and milk for Santa. That's their tradition. Like there's an idea that he'll come down the chimney and then have the cookies and milk. And of course, it's a game that parents will play with their kids where the kids will set out the milk and then the parents might like drink it in the night or something. And the kids will believe that Santa Claus drank it or something like that. But you could think of those as like religious offerings to a certain extent, or it's at least isomorphic to that. And it's interesting how that can appear at sort of these different levels of seriousness. Where, for example, the Santa Claus myth is kind of just for fun, and it can have a socially cohesive effect because everyone gets excited about Christmas and things like that. But then there can be a more serious, simultaneously, there can be a more serious worship of the actual figures behind the Christmas story and like the Christian tradition of Jesus and things like that, and the kind of that more serious dimension to it. So it's interesting how we have I think to humans, play is so important, and I see that with like my dog too, like how much he loves to play. I think that's important for mammalian brain development. Actually, is play. Like we kind of have these different levels of seriousness with which we engage with these stories and myths and things. And sometimes something will be appropriate in one moment, and it will be another. It will not be appropriate in another moment, and then we can have sort of a harmony between these different levels of seriousness or solemnity of engaging with these different myths and stories.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. The point, though, here is that you understand these gradients from
Hmm.
seriousness to play and back and forth, and there is no contradiction. That's the
Hmm.
thing. Like, you
Yeah.
can be playful and you can be serious, be the same person and have the same system of beliefs,
Hmm.
but you understand the context. Now, what happens if
Hmm.
you, let's say, some calamity strikes and now we are finished, our civilization collapses, and then 2000 years from now people find hints of what we were doing, and they were like, oh, they
Yeah.
believed in this flying grandpa figure. What is that about? Right.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
it's a little bit like that, where you have to imagine that people had exactly that same levity to understand that, okay, now things are serious, but okay, we can also be playful now, and there are
Mm.
levels to it.
I feel like that's a really subtle point, and that's something I had actually never thought about before. Because, like, yeah, like when you read the transcript or the historical, just kind of like read back of what we know about like ancient Greek culture, for example, you see like it's kind of this one-dimensional version where it's like these were the gods that they had, these were the stories that they had, but that layer of context and that layer of things being on a gradient from this is more playful to this is more serious, I feel like that can get lost because it's not necessarily something that it's so obvious to people who are living within that culture that it's not necessarily documented and spelled out. It's kind of just passed down. Like when I was a kid, for example, actually, this is a funny story. When I was a kid, I thought that Santa Claus was real, like, when I was very young. And then I eventually found out that Santa Claus was not real, and I was kind of heartbroken by that. Because I felt like I was trying to, of course, kids, they try to develop their understanding of the world. At the time, I felt like I had the idea in my mind that lying was bad because I had been taught that lying was wrong. And then I was presented with the fact that my parents had lied to me about Santa Claus, which was something that felt important to me. So I was presented with this contradiction, it seemed like. And I had to, and I feel like moments like that are how people, humans who are growing up, how they discover the idea of that gradient, for example. It's something where you kind of, in order to keep the consistency of your world, you need to sort of discover, oh, there's this way in which things can be different. There's this axis of variation, which I didn't understand before. But now I'm gaining information I'm perceiving things about how my parents treat me and about how everyone else is behaving. And I sort of generally understand that pattern. And then, of course, that gets passed down further. I remember there was a moment where I remember my mom tells this story. It's that when I was younger, and my sister, who was 5 years younger than me, my mom was telling my sister about Santa Claus soon after I found out that Santa wasn't real. And I was telling my mom, like, I tried to have this like serious conversation with my mom, like, please don't lie to Lauren about this. Like, this isn't real. This is wrong. Or I actually got upset about it. But then, like I was saying, then I eventually developed the understanding. So it's funny how that can work out.
Yeah. And of course, that kind of contradiction is how you are introduced to nuance, where it's like, well, you shouldn't lie. But here there are some important qualifiers where we are also raising a child. And what matters here is not just the truth, but it's a matter of building up its skills and let it explore its own world and let it face the contradictions of this world, and then little by little start having a sense of where certain precepts apply literally, where they apply figuratively, and where they don't apply at all. In other words, judgment. Where should something be applied or not? And that ultimately is what elevates us, where we don't just follow the rules or apply the rules, but we develop a sense of when is the time or the situation where the rules must be suspended. The application of the rules has to be suspended. And that is a rite of passage, as it were, where now you have grown out of mimicking or following mindlessly what has been said, and actually now being in control of that knowledge, of that body of work. And of course, that takes time, but it's ultimately acculturation. It's ultimately the upbringing of people and the initiation in the culture, and then if they have the skills to eventually be able to make their own contributions to culture.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you're saying there reminds me of the difference between sort of the difference of approaches, almost from a game theory perspective, of like rigidity versus fluidity when you're thinking about how you want to behave in a group of people. Because, for example, if you create a defined system of like a system of law, for example, or a system, some kind of encoding, some kind of system of precepts about the way that people should behave, there's always going to be things missing, or there are always going to be little edge cases there, or little exceptions to the system which might occur, which the system can't fully account for. So then you need to sort of balance, like, how does our group or how does our society want to treat, like, kind of the rigidity and the predictability of like sticking to our system and feeling security, because security feels important to us. But then how do we want to also have enough fluidity in there to where when situations arise, we don't have to cram things to fit the system and then lose. It's like a Procrustean bed where you cram things in. You might lose information. You might chop off a piece of something that was actually important to handle in another way. So we have have to balance that as a society, that kind of trade-off between rigidity and fluidity, or between security and flexibility to some extent.
Yeah, and this is fundamentally the central problem of human society. The central problem of social organization is exactly how to balance between stability, which you can call predictability, and then, of course, initiative, which you can call freedom or creativity. So how do we balance between those two? Because at one extreme, you give everybody the freedom to do whatever they want, but then that is not a viable society. Like if you have neighbors that start playing heavy metal at 3 in the morning, well, you cannot go to work the morning after, right? So ultimately,
Yeah.
there has to be some kind of rule where it says, no, you play heavy metal until, I don't know, 10 p.m. or whatever. Um, So it's exactly this kind of trade-off. And what happens if you take a big picture view of history, you can effectively see societies oscillate between the extremes, where it's like, oh no, now we are feeling really confident because also there is like economic growth, so we feel like we are enlightened, we are sophisticated, there is this inexorable progress of history, and
Yeah.
there is this moral progression towards ever higher nuances and understandings and so on.
Yeah.
And then there is an economic collapse, which coincides with a regression to, oh no, we need stability, we need safety, you cannot just do whatever you want. And no, you are not allowed to express yourself however you feel, you have to follow a certain playbook, etc., etc. And basically, we go through these ups and downs. And it's fascinating how that maps to feelings of safety versus initiative or creativity, but also material conditions of scarcity and then of affluence.
Right. Exactly. And that's another situation where the patterns within a certain person are expressed at the group level. The individual level kind of resonates with the group level. So, as an individual person, I might go through periods in my life where I feel like I'm going out to meet lots of different people. I'm going out to explore things. Maybe over time, I get psychologically tired out by that because I'm consuming so much new information. Then I want to spend a weekend just kind of in my house, like so, sitting at my desk or laying in bed and watching a show or listening to music or something like that. Like you see that happen at all those different levels.
And it's exactly that. It's exactly that. Again, the consistency of the world. What applies to
Yeah.
society it also works for individuals, where
hmm
it's ultimately what you want to be doing is a little bit of both. Like you
hmm
want to have a, of course, where exactly is the balance depends on the person, but ultimately you don't want to be on either of those extremes. There has to be
hmm
some kind of stability in your life, some things that are there which give you an idea of how tomorrow will look like, but it
hmm
cannot be too stable. Like there has to
hmm
be room for exploration and for creating something new or for being with people, experiencing things, and so on.
Yeah. And I think this is something I would be really interested to ask you about. I think you have an interesting perspective on kind of living your life in relation to these polarities, because a few of the blog posts that I've read on your website feature sections where you talk about kind of the way that you, at least in my interpretation of it, in the way that you sort of find balance in your lifestyle by living in a way that's kind of close to nature, or living in a way that's simplicity, in a way that is very in a way that's not divorced from the natural rhythms of your environment. I wonder if you could talk a little more about that, because I'm very interested in that. You seem to have a very balanced lifestyle.
And so, of course, it has to do with rhythm. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about music or about experiences like in the canoe or whatever. Like,
hmm
if you have intensity the whole time, that's not
hmm
viable in the literal sense. It's also not beautiful in the artistic sense, right?
hmm
Like you cannot
hmm
just have intensity. You have to have moments that are less stressful, less intense. And then
Yeah,
there has
tension
to
and
be a
resolution.
balance.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
hmm
So
hmm
there is a rhythm to life that will be viable. And then there are rhythms that are not viable. So
hmm
what I experienced in the city life I used to have is that
hmm
ultimately the city disempowers me. The city as a setting
mm
disempowers me because its rhythms are different than rhythms that I can tolerate over the long term. So of course I can go to the city, but to stay there, to live there long term is something that is difficult because the pace of change is such that I cannot keep up with it. I don't feel that I follow. I feel that I am left behind, or I feel that I have to rush. So there is this idea of I have to find harmony again. And harmony, in a sense, is what is in the natural order of things. Like in the natural order of things, there will be moments of tension, moments of conflict, moments of intensity, but they are not persistent. It's not always intense. Whereas city life will tend to be always intense. It's always busy. It's always noisy.
Yeah.
If you also follow the news cycle, there is imminent catastrophe at the next breaking news session.
Yeah.
So you feel that the world is collapsing. You feel that you are at the brink of calamity. Whereas if you take a step back of all that fast-paced life and you're like, okay, let me slow things down. What happens is that you eventually find harmony all around you, but that ultimately becomes harmony within you. Because now you're operating at a pace that is viable, a pace that is beautiful, in other words, if we were to liken that to art. And now what happens in practice is that you are operating from a position of control, because I no longer feel that I am being left behind and I must rush to catch up with what others are doing, because there is no catching up to be done. That's the thing. So everything flows from my own initiative. Everything flows when it should flow, when it is ready to flow. So everything comes about organically, which is exactly how things happen in nature. If I plant a tree today, I cannot force it to grow tomorrow. I have to wait for a few years. So when will the tree be ready? Well, when it's ready. Whenever that happens. And this is kind of how life is experienced. And that's a life that never puts a drain on you. Like you can keep doing it and you never feel like, oh, I need a break. A break from what? From something that is beautiful already? Like, what do you want? Of course, now I describe it in abstract terms, but it also connects to what we have been talking about.
So an interesting point there. So you said that living the city life in your past kind of made you feel left behind, or it made you feel like things were moving at too fast of a pace. As you were saying that, I was kind of thinking, could you possibly analogize the city or the nature of life in the city to kind of like a white noise type of signal, where white noise, for those who don't know, is a type of audio signal where every single frequency is present at the same amplitude or at the same intensity. So you can think of the city as a place where everything is kind of happening all at once. There are places of very high intensity, but you could also think of the city as maybe containing some peaceful places like parks and things like that. So could you, as a counterpoint to what you were saying, could you think of the city as a place where you don't necessarily could you think of the city as a place that's actually providing you sort of more options for how to live your life? And that can provide stress because then you have more choice and you might get more decision fatigue. But to your point about feeling overwhelmed by it, could you say that that feeling of being overwhelmed is actually something that is within your control, and that if you sort of properly acclimatize to that life, then you could sort of have this option-rich sort of banquet of possibilities at each moment, where if you find the right way to navigate it, you could live an internally peaceful life, even in a city environment?
Probably yes. Probably you can do that. It gives you options, though there are some things that are inherent in terms of the constraints. For example, of course, when I say city, I don't mean your average town. I mean like a big city. So what happens there? There are some things that are constant, like the noise level is constant. For example, if you come to this place, like people who are not used to this will be like, oh, this is eerily quiet.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's not really, right? If you pay attention, it's not actually that quiet. But you are used to this noise in the background, and you're like, oh, there is no noise. What is happening? I can actually hear the birds. I can actually hear the wind and the leaves moving in the wind, that sort of thing. But then there is the other thing, which is all the stimuli in a city are amplified, such as lights.
Hmm.
Lights in the city are more intense than lights that you will ever experience while you are on a walk in the countryside.
Yeah.
Motions are much more fast-paced. Like there are
Yes.
cars driving, and there is a noise together with the motion, and
Hmm.
these you cannot just get rid of. So
Hmm.
of course, the city gives you options, and you have things that you cannot have if you live in the middle of nowhere. And that's great and that's empowering. The tricky part is, can you reach a point where that is viable for you long term? Or
Hmm.
is it just, oh, I have options, therefore that's good, but that's just in your head? That's just a rationalization, but not how you actually feel. Do you
Mm.
feel in control, not whether you have options, of course. So of course that's
Mhm.
something that will depend on the person. I'm not saying that, well,
Mhm.
everybody should move to the mountains and become a monk. But what I'm saying is that each person has to be introspective and find the rhythm that is viable for them, and for each
Mhm.
person will be different, of course.
Mhm.
But just to add another point,
Mhm.
a small point on this is like,
Mhm.
there are many people who are like, you know what, I learned about this mindfulness meditation and these Buddhist monks, and they are doing these amazing
Mhm.
things, and now I will be doing the same.
Mm.
And I'm like, sure, good luck, but bear in mind that these monks also live in pristine environments where
Yeah.
the environment also contributes to that sense of mindfulness and meditation. So you will be trying to do that in an environment that is not necessarily optimal. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another context thing where sometimes the context can get lost in just the sort of transcript of the direct precepts or things like that. Now, I'd be curious on the point of this. I'd be curious, how do you feel that your sort of internal state and your sort of internal feelings, or the kind of the character of your daily life, how do you feel like? I'm assuming it's better now than it was when you lived in the city. I wonder how you would describe that difference, because for me, like, I'm at an age where I'm kind of thinking about, oh, where do I want to sort of go with my life, or kind of what environment would I like to live in one day. I would be curious for your experience about how you feel differently now
Hmm.
as opposed to when you were living a more chaotic life in a city.
In one word, it's control.
Mm.
I feel that what happens from a position of control. I feel
Mm.
that what happens in my life, of course, happens from a position of initiative where
Mm.
I don't feel like I was dragged into this. Oh, and I am not
Mm.
prepared for it. I feel like I
Mm.
made this happen. I am the driving force, and what I am experiencing now matches what I am prepared to experience because of this
Mm.
organic dimension to it that I mentioned. So, whenever there is an experience, I am ready for it. And it's an
Mhm.
experience that doesn't unsettle me and doesn't disempower me. It's an experience that is
Mm.
fulfilling, it's an experience that is enriching. And it's an experience that is, in other words, viable. It's an experience that is sustainable. I can keep doing that. But if I am
Mm.
always caught in a situation where I am not in control,
Mm.
ultimately I will rationalize that as, well, I am not good enough, or
Mm.
well, others are good at this, they are competent or whatever, they are skillful, I am not, I am just a failure. And then you internalize what is effectively a mismatch of rhythms. You internalize it as, well, I am defective, I am a
Mm.
lost cause and whatever. And basically you beat yourself up for a problem that is systemic, but you turn it into a problem that is individual. It's like, oh, it's my
Mm.
fault, when in reality it's an issue of the environment, of many contributing factors. And
Mm.
if you change the environment, you can change yourself, in effect. It's a little bit
Yeah.
like the fish which is out of water and beats itself up saying like, oh, I am not good at this walking business. Like, sure, but
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that you are useless as such, that you are not good at anything.
Mhm. Yeah, and it reminds me of how you can think of it as us absorbing our environment. Like when you live in the city and there's chaos around you, like you pay the price of that by the fact that the chaos sort of almost seeps into your mind. And it's also reminding me of how there's this kind of reality of city life, at least for me, where you're in this situation of having to be on alert all the time, because like for example the fast-paced nature of the city, like for example if you think of cars on the highway going through the city, you think of the fast-paced nature of that as creating a danger, and then your danger sense as a human is kind of activated by those fast moving, or for example those loud stimuli. So you kind of have this pattern of needing to be on alert. Like for example, when you're driving on the highway somewhere, you need to be constantly watching all around you at a high level of alertness in case someone is merging into your lane, or in case someone stops suddenly, because it could result in a fatal collision. But if
Mm-hmm.
you're, for example, just walking through the hills, or you're walking through some natural area, you don't need to be, I mean, you might be generally aware of your surroundings, but you don't need to be looking all around you all the time at a high level of alertness. And I feel like a consistent lifestyle of being on that level of alertness leads to a stress, an underlying, it's like a price that you pay for being in that kind of
Mm-hmm.
environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's exactly this. And when it comes to the stimuli we get, it's ultimately what influences us. Like, we know about
Mm.
food, for example. There is this saying, like, well, you are what you eat, which may be
Mm.
simplistic, but ultimately there is truth to it, right?
Yeah.
But isn't it the same? Like, you are what you absorb in terms of information, in terms of
Yeah.
stimuli. Like, you
Hmm.
are what you hear, you are what you see, you are
Hmm.
what you keep processing in your brain. Why would that be any different? Because that is not just a process in the brain and it has no further consequence. That is a process in the
Hmm.
brain which creates a cascade of effects that ultimately condition you in a certain biochemical way. Like, there is a
Hmm.
mechanism there. It's not just, I thought of it. There is no such thing. I thought of it, therefore something happened.
Hmm.
Physically something happened. So
Yeah.
in the same way, we want to be careful with what we eat or drink or breathe. It wouldn't be any different with what we process in terms of ideas or stimuli at large.
Yeah. And I think that ties into the idea of the harmfulness, the potential harmfulness of blaming yourself for your patterns of behavior, when in reality you might be in an environment which is just not conducive to healthy patterns of behavior. Like I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and I was talking about how often I struggle because I don't feel like I have enough energy or I have enough motivation to do certain things. And basically he was kind of consoling me, and he was saying, well, if you consider the patterns of your environment, if you consider different facts about your sleep schedule or your diet or things like this, like you could be in unhealthy patterns or unhealthy rhythms, which make it basically extremely difficult to function in certain productive ways. So, like, there could be a situation where instead of, it might be more effective to say, instead of, it's my fault for being too lazy or for being too tired or something like that, you could more just say, I have, through the course of things, ended up in a situation where I'm in certain unhealthy routines. And just in an impersonal way, I can acknowledge that and say, these routines are unhealthy. It would be better for me to change my routines and develop a position where my body is able to function more naturally because I'm in a healthier rhythm. So I feel like that can be important, because over the years I've had different times where I've been very hard on myself for certain things, and that was never a productive time. That was always a time where I just kept feeling bad about myself, and then I wanted to comfort myself by resting more, by receding from things. I feel like it's generally been more effective for me to just say, to just kind of impersonally acknowledge what's happening, and then sort of try to move, and then you can sort of move from a position of strength because you're not sort of injuring yourself psychologically.
Mm-hmm. And then to add to this, there is, of course, a connection between our mental state and our physical state. And this is something I
Hmm.
experienced through the sleep cycle, for example, where,
Hmm.
let me put it a little bit differently. If you think that everything is a function of willpower, like, oh,
Hmm.
if I truly believe it, it will happen, then you are wrong. You are simply
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
So I experienced this with the sleep cycle, where I was like, I need to sleep better. I need to sleep continuously. I need to sleep well so that I
Hmm.
wake up and I am energized and ready to go.
Hmm.
So what happened is that I learned through experience that exposure to the sunlight actually regulates your sleep cycle. It helps you sleep better.
Hmm.
And I'm like, I would have never think about this. I would be like, oh, okay, I just don't have to drink coffee in the evening or something.
Hmm.
So, which of course is a good idea, but exposure to the sunlight, like, you cannot just think about that. And now that's your will. And the strength of your volition will make it happen. No, just expose yourself to an environment that is appropriate, and that will already be benign for you. So that's a very simple thing, which has far-reaching consequences. Because, of course, if your sleep is better, your mood is better. Uh, when your mood
Yeah.
is better, you have more energy as well. You are more creative. When you are more creative, you feel empowered to do more things. You feel good
Yeah.
about yourself. You are like, oh, look at me. I do all these wonderful things. I make things happen. And of course, that has a domino effect.
Yeah, and of course your relationships are better when you're in a better mood and you're a more happy person. Like you sort of there's a saying which is like kind of like you get what you put in basically. You
Mm-hmm.
get back what you put in, and that definitely helps when you put yourself in a more positive position where you're just living a healthier lifestyle. You can then be a more positive you can play a more positive role in the lives of like the people around you as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's exactly that. And the same is for the experiences you will have with other people. Like,
Mm.
once you are in a certain state, without even saying anything, you communicate a certain vibe, as they call it. But we have this intuition of what another person is thinking, of what goes through their head. If you are really stressed, the others can feel it. Maybe they are not
Yeah.
well attuned to it, but they can feel it. So what
Yeah.
happens is that if you are stressed, you elicit in others a stressful response that may be an agitation of some kind. They may be
Mm.
angry more easily or whatever. So
Yeah.
ultimately, your experience will be a negative experience, and then that creates a vicious cycle. Whereas if you are in control of your emotional state slash your mental state, ultimately that brings in more positivity, and it creates a virtuous cycle
Hmm. Okay,
through
so
the
on
communication, which is nonverbal.
hmm okay, so on the subject of that, on the subject of kind of being in a positive position where your lifestyle is matching natural rhythms and you can be a more effective contributor to your own life and to other people's lives. I'd be curious about this because you have produced so much quality work over the years, a lot of it for free. And I'd be curious just as a question to you, like, is there anything, because this is something I'm thinking about in my own life as well, like, is there anything that you feel like you're searching for? Like when you imagine yourself as the hero of your story, like do you see any kind of goal, any kind of special island that you're sailing out in search of? Or do you more just think of yourself as going about your life in the way that feels best for you and the things that you're doing are just kind of natural products of that process? Or do you feel like they're organizing or working towards a particular singular sort of large goal?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The way I approach this, and again, it will depend on the person, but the way I approach this is that, in a sense, I am on a quest for self discovery and self
Mm.
realization. Like, who am I, or
Hmm.
who can I be? But not
Hmm.
who can I be in terms of, well, let me fake something, but through the continuous effort, who can I actually become?
Right.
And in so doing, of course, that will have consequences for my surroundings, for
Hmm.
others in the world. Because if, let's say, I discover myself as somebody who writes useful articles, let's say,
Hmm.
then these articles are of use to other people. So what
Hmm.
I did is to discover the fact that I can do this. What others get is the side effect or the byproduct of that exploration, which is, oh, there is this thing now, which is the article that we can read about and have some further thoughts on.
Hmm.
So even though it's introspective or might seem like self-centered endeavor, in practice,
Hmm.
I think it is pro-social, because
Hmm.
this introspection is not about what will others say about me. So it's not about seeking validation, not, oh, let me do what is the most popular thing right now, let me do it well, and that will bring me plaudits or accolades or friends, etc. Rather, it's
Yeah.
let me do that which is inherent to me, but let me do it as best I can.
Hmm.
And through that, I will be the best version of myself, which can then maybe be of use to others. But it's not about being of use to others. That's just a happy coincidence. That's
Mm.
just nice that it happened.
Hmm. Yeah, I like the way you described that. I would probably end up describing a similar thing if I were asked the same question. One of the reasons that I think I left my previous job is that the work I was doing just didn't feel like it was helping anyone. Like, the software, like, yes, I was working to make this piece of software better, but it just wasn't a piece of software where I could see any kind of positive impact on anyone's life. And I think that's one of the things that made me kind of leave that situation and go back to a situation where, I'm living close to my family so I can help them, or I'm living in a place where I can have more time to develop my music and so on and so forth. Like, and one of the things is I feel like as a person who's trying to develop themselves and everything, you run into these. You have to sort of try to identify the consistent elements that pervade across many different kinds of experiences. And one thing for me is that in my life and just in my experience, probably like many people, I experience these juxtapositions, these sort of harsh juxtapositions of experience, which can lead to almost a confusion. And it can be a skill to try to find the experience within that. So, for example, or to find the consistency through it. So, like, for example, like one night I might be out playing music at like a jazz club, or I might be playing music at some kind of public place where I'm feeling very positive and I'm feeling very connected to people around me, and my music is having a very positive effect on people. I can see people getting excited, I can see people clapping, I can tell that I'm adding to the happiness and to the social beauty and to the social experience of this moment. So I feel very almost complete in that moment, that really inspired by that. But then maybe the next day I run into a situation where um, let's say I sleep in too late and then I wake up and I feel tired all day, and then I'm feeling bad about myself, and then I'm trying to do something later in the day, but I am not able to. I try to write some kind of program, but I end up just getting stuck, or I don't make much progress. I can't. I think one of the things we encounter as people are these juxtapositions between feeling very effective and feeling very complete, and then maybe even the next day feeling the opposite, feeling pathetic, feeling bad about yourself. And I feel like it's almost like being on choppy water. It's like being on a storm in the sea, going back to that thing you said earlier, where you're kind of being tossed around, and it can be disorienting or nauseating to be in that kind of rhythm. And I feel like one of the things I'm trying to do in my life is find a more consistent rhythm, or a more healthy rhythm in my life, so I can have more predictability and just kind of lead a more healthy lifestyle. And that's why I was so interested by some of the things you were saying about rhythm and about control and a feeling of initiative and things like that.
And this also is what we were saying about predictability slash stability, and then the initiative or the freedom or the creativity, which is, for example, you say, I sleep late and then I wake up late and now I want to do stuff, but I'm tired or I don't feel like
Yeah.
it. So, for example, that connects to something that is a basic routine, which is the sleep cycle. Like,
Hmm.
if I have like a stable routine in that regard, in a sense, it's boring, right? But in another
Yeah.
sense, it's what empowers me to do the non boring things,
Yeah.
which is exactly to be creative and to do all that. Whereas
Hmm.
if I don't get the basics right, then it's hard to get the others consistently, the
Yeah.
more demanding kind of tasks. So that's why it's important to be mindful of your own condition, do this introspection where it's like, what is the rhythm that works for me?
Hmm.
And that's my baseline. And now, from a position of control slash strength, I can now do what I really want to do, which is all the creative endeavors I have.
Hmm. And of course, there can be trade-offs there too, because, like, for example,
Mm-hmm.
let's say I want to play at a jazz session
Mm-hmm.
um, on Wednesday night, for example. It might start at 10:30. I might be playing until past midnight, and then it might be hard to maintain that sleep schedule. So there can be trade-offs, but I feel like ultimately, yeah, it is super beneficial to just have that consistent schedule, to have that
Mm-hmm.
baseline to build on top of. Because I feel like if you try to reach for um, if you try to reach directly for good results without building a good foundation, you might get some good results, but you'll also get some negative swings or some negative compensation sort of
Mm-hmm.
as a payment for that.
And me, this is something I understood from an early age by doing sport.
Mm.
And so, football in this case, soccer.
Hmm.
So, with any kind of course, this applies to anything again, but with sport now.
Hmm.
So, what you want is to go play. You don't want to do the boring drills.
Right.
But if you do the drills right, you will always play the game at a higher level. There is no chance about that. Other things being equal. If you
Hmm.
skip the drills, you will never be good at the game. or you will never
Yeah.
be as good as you could be. So the drills, in a sense, are boring, but it's those boring details that ultimately empower you to do the fun parts.
Hmm.
And it's really that, like to be able to invest time and effort into the basics, into the foundation, and build a strong foundation. And of course, what that means concretely will depend on what you are doing, what sort of lifestyle you have. But you ultimately want to have a foundation that is rock solid. And again, because we are talking about this theme of consistency, that is no different than building a house. You cannot build a house that doesn't have a solid foundation. It's as simple as
Hmm.
that. The
Hmm.
ground level has to be movable, and then you build on top. If the ground level is shaky, whatever you put on top might work for a little while, but as soon as there is a strong wind or an earthquake or whatever, it all comes down crashing.
Yeah.
You cannot have a fair weather construction.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And if you don't, I feel like if you don't have a solid foundation, or if you're lacking one, the first step to creating one is it would be acknowledging that you don't have a solid foundation, and that can be psychologically difficult because that kind of ties into ego. And I've been thinking about this recently, and I think that a person's ego, in the sort of in the sense of the word egotistical, a
Mhm.
person's ego is kind of this almost this shell that forms around the insecurities that we have, and it's this kind of protective shell that prevents the insecurities from getting hurt. But that protective shell can turn into a barrier when you try to then investigate those insecurities and acknowledge them, as part of a pursuit of fixing them, or in pursuit of getting better. You kind of run into that ego layer, and you see this with people when sometimes, if you make a valid point about someone, or if you ask them to do something differently, you might sometimes you'll get a response which is positive, but sometimes if someone's ego is shelled up around that area, you might get a very harsh response. You might knock into that barrier, and it might create a dissonance there. So I feel like also, like, kind of part of the result of, like, kind of exploring and living in this initiativized way is, like, kind of like shedding those layers of ego and everything, and just kind of being open to being wrong about things, being open to recognizing when your foundation is not strong enough, and when you need to put in time, when you need to put
Mhm.
in that time to build it back.
Yeah, and of course that is difficult, especially to get started, because fundamentally what has to happen is that you have to be overpowered by something that is clearly superior to you. Because what
Yeah.
happens with the ego at this defensive phase is that
Hmm.
you think you are the real deal.
Hmm.
Of course, you know that you are faking it, but you think you are the real deal, like you are untouchable.
Yeah.
But once you experience awe, once you experience that which is clearly superior to you in every way, once you see that there are greater
Hmm.
magnitudes, then you start admitting to yourself that, well, actually, I'm not as strong or as important as I think I am. And
Hmm.
actually, there are layers to this, there are levels to this. And
Hmm.
so you gradually let go of that, and then you can ascend. But if
Hmm.
you maintain the view that, well, I am the real deal, you won't be for much longer. And this also
Right.
applies to, for example, those actors that are superstars at the age of 15 or whatever, and then
Hmm.
they disappear after a few years. It's because
Hmm.
you think you are the real deal and everybody will always love you. And then years go by and you haven't actually put in any effort. You think you are the best. So what happens is you are not actually the best. So eventually you are left behind and people don't care about you. Or you were, let's say, a celebrity and now you are, I don't know, 60 years old. And again, people don't really care about you. You are not the new hotness anymore. Like, it doesn't
Hmm.
matter. So unless you are able to actually look at the mirror and say, you know what, I am not that special. I am not as special as I think I am. Once you
Hmm.
reach the point where you can say that, that is the point where you start actually growing spiritually, let's say, or as a person, and then you are
Hmm.
really empowered to kick things up a notch or two.
Yeah. And that's another trade-off situation, because I feel like that belief that we sometimes have that we are this powerful, highly capable being, is another mechanism which actually helps us to be ambitious and to pursue things which might be out of our current scope of abilities. It might give us inspiration to believe that we can actually do it. Like certain
Mhm.
things, like, for example, when you think of aviation, like airplanes and stuff. That's something which obviously would have seemed impossible if humans didn't have the sort of wild ambition to try to create flying machines and everything. I visited aviation museum recently, and there were some funny political cartoons in the museum which were actually denigrating those early flying machines, making fun of them, saying that investment in them was a complete waste of time, that they were just ridiculous mimics of birds and things like that. But then you see how that ambition can obviously lead to an amazing result. So I feel like that's another situation where within the individual, you have to find a balance between your ambition, but also your realism and your recognition that there are things which are out of your control.
And then the bridge within those two is exactly honesty. It's exactly to say, of course, there is ambition in the sense of where I want to go, like I want to fly, and then where I am right now, which is, of course, I don't actually have the capacity to fly. So you recognize where you are, and then you can move towards where you want to be. But if you don't have that honesty, you will never move forward because you think you are the best, you are impeccable.
Right. You might think you're already there, for
Yeah,
example.
exactly. And then it's like, well, that's not the case. And then this is something that also you see with people where the people that have depth, and you're like, well, you are simpler than I thought, in the sense that, well, you are cool, you are a cool guy or whatever, right? And part of that is because you don't think that you need to show that you are the real deal. Because you're like, well, I reached this level, but actually I know that there are more levels to it. So in the grand scheme of things, I'm still not that good. So of course there is more for me to learn, more for me to develop. And
Yeah.
of course that keeps you grounded in a sense that you are a nice person, but also concretely, it keeps you grounded in this sense of urgency, which ultimately has a creative potential because you are not complacent and you keep going. You're like, well, I'm not done here. I have to produce more and more and better. And I will keep doing it until I am not able to.
Yeah, and it also keeps you open to new experiences, right? Like I was telling a friend of mine that I was meeting with you, like today, and they were like, "Oh, how did you get a meeting with him?" And I'm like, "He'll meet with anybody. I just emailed him," and they kind of couldn't believe it. They thought I told them that you were this really highly respected software developer and everything, but I feel like that openness is so important. And if you notice, I feel like I can think of times where I've been studying sort of like great artists and things like that because I'm obviously interested in art and everything, and they have this almost this consistently fresh perspective on things where they're not bored by things, they're not arrogant about things, they're interested in even um, the most seemingly insignificant detail. And I feel like that openness just keeps information flowing into you, and of course you are what you absorb, so that can keep you as kind of fresh and enriched as possible.
And a word that comes to mind now, based on what you said, is play, where it's like, of course, you want to keep things flowing, which in a way is in a way of saying, well, you remain playful. You want to continue to explore and play around and see how that works, which necessarily means that you don't take yourself slash achievements too seriously. You're like,
Right.
well, of course, they are what they are, but it's not like the center of the world. There is more to it. And
hmm
that's why you are open to exactly play with new things.
hmm Yeah, and that relates to a solution which I know is there, but sometimes I just don't take it up all the time. Like it basically, when I because a lot of my goal as a musician, which I spend a lot of time doing, is to create a good discography, like good EPs, good albums, things like that. And one of the things that happens is that I'll create a piece of music which I think is quite good, and then it will make it so much more difficult to create the next piece of music because I think I want to keep one-upping myself. I want to keep topping myself, keep creating better and better music that goes further. And sometimes you reach in the leveling war with yourself, you reach a sort of ceiling where you're like, well, I'm kind of at the limit right now of what I can conceptualize. I can't really guarantee to myself that I will make something better than what I just made, because what I just made was sort of at the max I was firing on all cylinders when I was doing that. And that can lead to what some people would call writer's block, which is where you basically don't feel motivated to create more music because you feel like, well, the next thing I create might just be worse, and that's obviously a psychologically difficult feeling. But the way out of that, which just requires some actuation energy to get going, is just to play around with new materials. Don't have any expectation. I once heard a writer call this writing for the wastebasket. Like, write with the intention that you'll probably just throw it away. Just create music with the intention that you're just playing around, you're just exploring ideas, and that's how the best music often gets made. It's just through natural conversation and the natural exploration, because the subtleties that emerge from that are not too designed, they're not too worked on. They're just naturally emergent.
And you do that exactly. You have this openness to playing with new ideas, to creating for the waste bin, exactly because you don't take yourself too seriously. Like, if you take yourself too seriously, you're like, well, what I have is unassailable. We should never touch it. We should never question it. We should never, ever deviate from it. So, of course, if you have that kind of attitude towards your own self or your own works, then it is impossible to ever treat your works as potential trash.
Yeah.
So by having that sense of play, that sense of, well, I don't take myself too seriously, then it's totally okay. It's part of the process to have work that is potentially waste. But when you do that, actually, it's never wasteful. Actually, you may not publish it so in that sense, it's for the waste bin, but it has always contributed something. You have learned something. You are inspired to explore something further, and that again puts you in a certain flow. And I think that is really a creative endeavor ultimately. Like, it cannot be for nothing.
Yeah. And of course, when we talk about creativity, like, creating something is inherently unpredictable. And unless you're making a replica, if you're creating something new, you just don't know what it's going to be yet. And if you try to kind of jump to the conclusion of feeling good about yourself because you think it's going to be great, that's ultimately a limiting. You're just kind of funneling yourself down into this serious mode where you're like, I am creating something good, but in actuality, it's best to not worry about how good or bad something might be. Just do stuff, and then evaluate. You can always evaluate it later. You can still evaluate your work in a serious way. You can just do that after. Kind of two different mindsets. Creating and evaluating should kind of be different mindsets. Because when you try to mix them, you eventually end up with cognitive overload, and then your creativity is inhibited.
And what also happens there is that you develop a criterion for judging / assessing your work, which is no longer yourself, where you are like, well, what will others think about this? What will others enjoy? What will others appreciate? And then when that happens is now, well, you cannot know. You are not others. You are not them. So what effectively takes hold then is your insecurities. Because you're like, well, the worst case scenario, that is what will govern your thoughts. So whereas if it springs from within, where it's like, you know what, I will do what I feel like, what feels right to me. Like, I want to play with this concept, with this idea, see what happens, because that feels good to me. I don't know if others will like it, but that's something that we will know in retrospect. If I try to anticipate it because I am not the others, then I am just putting obstacles. And of course, these obstacles are, in effect, my fears.
And of course, that's what the audience loves as well. In my experience of music and playing music for people love to see someone just being themselves and doing what feels good to them. And then often people can enjoy that and they can get invested in it, and then that can make them feel good. People don't tend to like being pandered to. And people don't like trying to be, like, spoon-fed something that they like, because then it becomes this awkward situation where, like, for example, if I try to play a piece of music for someone based on, like, what I think they'll enjoy the most, that makes it awkward for me because then I'm not doing what's natural for me. And it also makes it awkward for them because they might be able to sense that I'm trying to impress them. And then they have this awkward situation where they're kind of like feeling like they have to judge it or they have to say what they think of it or something like that. It's so much more free and so much more exciting if I just am at the piano or whatever, and I'm just doing whatever feels completely natural to me, authentically expressing myself, and then someone can tune into that and kind of hear that natural. kind of flow of like my ideas, and then they can not feel any pressure to react to it. They can just experience it, and often that will produce by far the most like positive reaction from the
Mm-hmm.
audience.
Mm-hmm. And it's that exactly. And then it also is, well, that's the only viable way, because you always have a sense of how you feel about things, but you don't have a good sense of how others feel. So, of course, you might
Hmm.
anticipate what somebody will like because it's your friend or whatever, but you cannot
Hmm.
anticipate what a stranger will like. So
Hmm.
ultimately, either you will limit your experiences to the realm of the known, like just your friends and nobody else,
Hmm.
so that you always get positive feedback, or you will be like, okay, it springs from within, I have to feel good about it, and then that means that you also open yourself up to others and then to other experiences.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And sometimes, like for example, there have been situations where I'm playing music for someone. Let's say I'm playing at the student union at my university or whatever. I'm just playing somewhere, and someone will often ask me like, there have been times where I've been asked like, "Oh, do you know this song, or can you play this song?" And sometimes I like maybe I could try to play that song, but I don't really know it. It would kind of be not the best version. I often say to them, well, instead, how about I just create something for you completely spontaneously? I improvise something on the spur of the moment, something fresh, something exciting, and then I'll often invite them to play with me, like, oh, press these notes and it'll sound cool and everything. That to me, I think people have a sometimes people have a sort of they come in with the idea that they'd like to hear something they know, but actually it might be much more exciting for them to hear something that they don't yet know, because then they have a fresh experience. So sometimes you have to like kind of introduce that to someone, and then they often get on board with it, and then you have a great time together.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's cool too, because it's something that if you improvise a piece of music, like that's what happens in jazz or in my personal style, where I improvise in kind of almost like a style that uses impressionist harmony and things like that. It's when you improvise something, it's similar to the conversation we're having now. It's a conversation that's never been had before in this exact way, and it probably will never be had again in this exact way. So it's that uniqueness of the kind of fruits of that process being so special in that moment. It's like only privy to the audience who is there, unless it's being recorded, of course. But still, that first performance retains its specialty even amidst recording. So that's
Mm-hmm.
another
Mm-hmm.
exciting thing. Is always being in the flow. This is one thing I try to do with music, in the flow of creating new stuff and trying things out. Because sometimes, because music is a muscle memory thing, it can be easy to get caught in playing the same patterns, playing the same chords, playing the same kinds of structures, and often it can be you need to freshen your experience by getting out of that, and that will lead to the most exciting results for you and for the audience.
And I imagine a part of that is to try to develop more muscle memory, like more patterns, which you do through play, through experimentation.
And through practice, yeah. Like for
And of
example,
course, yeah.
I'm going to practice the all these different scale patterns in all 12 keys, for example. It might be really boring, but then later when you're playing around and just kind of freely experimenting, you'll have muscle memory to do these things which you couldn't do before. So less of the territory is blocked off. Like when you're kind of a beginner as a musician, let's say you only practice in C major, when you're trying to wander the landscape of creativity, it's like you're on this narrow road where everything else is blocked off. You can still move around and you can do a lot of patterns, but you can't go anywhere. But when you develop muscle memory for all the different possibilities, or for all the different little kind of what would you call them, like little generating ideas, like scales and arpeggios and things like that, then you can just sort of go anywhere. It exponentially expands what you can play with. You have more toys essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, more combinations between them. So it's an emergent
Yes.
game, as it
Exactly.
were.
Exactly. Exactly. And so much of composition, in my experience, is just the ability to kind of develop a path through that forest of options. Because there are so many options available, especially if you're creating music with computers, as I sometimes do. You can create literally any sound signal. It becomes, you need to develop sort of a curator's ear for what kind of sounds you want to create. And in order to create a coherent piece of music, you often want to have specific themes. Just like in this conversation, we have specific themes which we sort of talk about. We might move on, but then we might circle back to them. You often want to do the same thing in a piece of music. So
Mm-hmm.
you kind of need to develop this ability to kind of develop a conversation or to develop a little language of certain themes, where it's like, I'm going to start debuting this theme, and then I'll take it in some new directions, and then I might introduce a new theme later, but then circle back to the old one. That's often what creates a set that ties into the narrative aspect of how we hear and understand things. We hear that story, which, if you're going through the story of your life or a story of a book or something, there will be recurring characters, and that's what allows us to feel emotionally invested in the story.
And then what you are saying now connects also to this discussion about I am at a certain point in my life where I have to make decisions. It's a little bit like that, because if you think of a life as basically all the noises, all the signals that can be produced, right? Of course, there are all these possibilities. And what do you do? It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you go a certain way and you develop certain patterns. So it's a matter of commit to that and proceed and see where it leads you.
And I feel like the results of that process is something which we might call wisdom, colloquially, right? Like someone who has taken their due diligence and taken their time to invest themselves within a certain path or to have certain focus in their life, and then they develop, like we were talking about before, that general understanding that can transfer to other areas. And often, of course, we consider older people to be usually wiser because they've simply had more time to carry out that process.
Yeah, and I think this is the case. And what is also the case on that is that you will find wisdom in people that you would least expect, in the sense of what I mean is that nowadays we have this idea that, of course, there is science, there are all these experts and people who know stuff. So if you are to find wisdom, you will find it in those circles. But the reality is that you can find it in your barber or a farmer or some person that you would never associate with wisdom, because of the consistency of the world, because what they have done is they have understood a part of the world in depth, which allows them to relate to other parts. And that is ultimately what gives them this feeling that, oh, they actually have depth to them, and well, they are wise.
Yeah, exactly. And that reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, which is from my favorite author, James Joyce. He said that there's no such thing as a normal person. There's each person has obviously a unique life experience, and they have unique understanding that's emerged as a result of living through that life experience. So that's why conversation is so fascinating to me. And I feel like you probably share a similar view of this. Like, you'll do the Prot Asks series where you'll talk to anyone about anything essentially, and that enables you to explore all the uniqueness of these different people who might email you and reach out to you and things like that.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And it's about being able to, like, through discussion, being able to get a sense of what the world is like through the words of this other person. It's in a way a gateway to another world for me, and of course for anybody who engages in conversation. So listening in that regard is essential. Like, somebody who doesn't listen, of course there are a lot of people who actually don't listen. Like, you say something and they didn't actually pay attention to what you said, or maybe they got one small part of it. But listening ultimately is how you can learn more about the world, how you can learn more about others as well, and then how you can learn more about yourself ultimately through this synthesis that you will do, where you're like, okay, there is this and I feel that, and what can I learn about this? What are the lessons to be drawn? What is the truth to be had from this?
Yeah, and that also relates to a sort of ego breakdown, in my view, because like sometimes we have this egotistical idea where, in addition to thinking that we are maybe a great hero of our story and everything, we also might think of other people as, we might group other people together and think these people are all the same, or these people are following this idea which I don't agree with, and you end up generalizing and kind of squishing down and compressing the idea of that group of people, and that can close you off to conversation. So that's another openness thing, is like, of course, it's a commonly known idea that if people who maybe disagree with each other online or something, if they have a conversation in person, they might actually resonate with each other and they might become friends and they might find common ground and things like that. I feel like conversation, in addition to being useful for gaining information, is also like a sobering tool where you realize, well, this person who I maybe thought was so different from me, I connect with them, or we're much more similar than we are different, or something like that. And of course, in a time where there's so much disagreement and so much seemingly intense disagreement between political parties and things like that, at least in the United States where I live, like conversation and open conversation is so important. It sounds like a cliche at this point because that point has been made many times, but I think it is true.
And I think part of the reason you see this kind of breakdown in terms of, well, people are either in one camp / echo chamber or another, and
Mm-hmm.
there is no discourse, is because the communication we have is through text. And what we lose is the emotional component of it, because
Mm-hmm.
we like to think that we are rational agents, which we are not. There is a component, there is a side of us, a facet of us, which is rational, but we also
Mm-hmm.
have an emotional side, which we cannot decouple from the rational side. It is
Mm-hmm.
always there. And when
Mm-hmm.
you reduce everything to text, you don't communicate the non-verbal aspects. You don't
Mm-hmm.
communicate how a person looks at you, and you don't communicate this sense of vulnerability, or you don't communicate any kind of emotional state. So if you send me a text message, all I see is a text message, and
Mm-hmm.
I have to then extrapolate an emotional state based on some words.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, I do that without seeing you, without experiencing you. I do that
Mm-hmm.
using my imagination. And what will happen then? Projecting my insecurities onto the text, and now
Yeah.
you said something which is not there. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, that is what creates conflict, and that is what ultimately destroys trust, reason, and simplicity. Like we should be able to be casual, but we cannot.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
part of that is because we communicate in a way that is not meant to be the standard way. It should be the exception, not the norm.
Mm-hmm. But of course, it's so convenient that in a way it's become the norm, right?
It is convenient, and it's also what also connects to the fast pace I was telling you earlier, because
Mm.
through text, of course, you can, like, you log into any stream of information, and there is just text flowing,
Mm-hmm.
and you cannot physically keep up with that. Like,
Yeah.
everywhere you go, there are all these thousands of comments, and you don't have connection to thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
You have connection to thousands of comments. But
Yeah.
then what happens is you develop an impression, which again is a projection of your own mental state.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like, oh, I got to experience 1,000 people. I got to experience an amalgamation of these, which is ultimately my fears that latch on to certain expressions and certain pieces of text. Fears or biases, or like the parts that I want to see, basically validation. And
Yeah.
what happens is that ultimately it's one misunderstanding that feeds into another misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that creates, at the social level, of course, creates conflict. But individually as well, you are actually feeling, maybe you don't verbalize it yet, but you feel that you don't belong there. Like,
Yeah.
just as the others are snippets of text with no face or person
Mm-hmm.
attached to them, you
Yeah.
are the same. You are
Mm-hmm.
just a snippet of text. You are nothing. You don't
Yeah.
have feelings. You are not flesh and bone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that same projection of things onto someone, or that same kind of missing information about someone's actual intention, that can also happen in person, but it's just much more. It's much more likely to happen more quickly when you have that kind of information deprived environment of the text and everything. But that pattern of projecting insecurities onto someone else, that can be very invisible to you if you haven't noticed it yet. or very invisible to someone if they haven't noticed it yet. And it can happen in person too. And this thing I was thinking, what you were saying about text makes me think about something I've thought about before, which is like kind of the limits of language itself. Because even when we're in person talking, our language has a certain nature to it, and it's developed in a certain way, and it's the tool we use to communicate. It's a very rich tool, but it also has certain almost assumptions that are built within it. Like I forget who this quote is from, but there was some maybe philosopher who said that if you speak a language, you already have beliefs. Like that is already kind of a belief system that you're already holding. So there are certain kind of things that come along with that. And I've often thought before how um, it can be hard. Sometimes I feel like at different times in my life, I've had this inherent desire to sort of fully elucidate or fully explain myself and fully explain my feelings to other people. And there was sort of a pain that happened when I realized that the language that I had to do it with, obviously it could be a skill issue as well, but it's almost like, it almost can feel like trying to communicate something complex or communicate feelings. It can feel like like a entire, trying to squish an entire city into a mailbox or something. There only a small amount of information can get through that little pipe of communication. So I feel like, of course, in person is so much richer, and I always prefer that. But like, there are also, I'm interested in the limits of what's possible to communicate as well, because our internal states, if you think about the full internal state of the person, there is no clear way to communicate the totality of that, you know?
And this is why rationality is just one of our facets, because you are like, well, I'm trying to explain a certain emotion. Can you actually describe beauty? If somebody hasn't experienced it, can you actually engender in them a sense of beauty without them experiencing it? Can you actually
Mm,
describe awe? Or to put it differently,
mm,
how does a child that doesn't have the intellectual capacity of an adult in terms of
mm-hmm,
knowledge and whatever they use to argue
mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
make a persuasive point, how does a
Yeah,
child experience awe? And you know they have experienced awe, like, oh, look at this bird, like for
yeah,
the
yeah.
first time. Uh,
Yeah.
and you're like, there are certain things, is my point, that cannot actually be communicated in that way. So there are
Mm-hmm.
things that have to be experienced, and we have to recognize that we cannot be reductive in the sense of let's
Mm-hmm.
bring everything down to a reasonable, communicable kind of package, because
Yeah.
that is so we say it's reductive exactly
Mm-hmm.
because it reduces from what it
Yeah.
actually is. So it takes away from it.
Yeah.
So if I tell you, oh, beauty is just something that happens in the brain, well, that's reductive and it reduced from what actually you experienced.
Yeah.
So basically, what I'm trying to say is that eventually we have to recognize the limits of language, but not as a way of saying, therefore, we cannot continue. Therefore, we have to have experiences that are
Yeah.
also of another level, that are not just verbal.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, a dance is no longer about if I have the right words for it. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know what you will experience, like the dancer, or what I am
Mm-hmm.
experiencing, if it's the same as you. And
Yeah.
ultimately, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And there's sort of that inherent, I feel like an understanding of that leads to the sort of inherent error margin within communication, where, for example, if we're both looking at the color red and we both say, oh, look at this red color here, like we might, it's hard to know like what our experience of even that simple stimulus is like. It might be totally different on the interior, or not totally different, but at least somewhat different. But there's this inherent, like there's this kind of situation where it's close enough to where we can talk about different experiences, and it's close enough to establish a communication that can flow and that can transfer information. But we're not sure, of course, what the actual contents are for each interlocutor. But as you said, it doesn't matter. It's sort of a natural variation on each side, and that variation ultimately can inspire different people in different ways. And as long as we can communicate enough, then we can make progress and we can communicate with each other.
Mm-hmm. And by putting ourselves in the situation of trying to communicate, of accepting that there is a margin of
Hmm.
error,
Hmm.
ultimately means that we won't be bellicose. We won't be
Hmm.
creating conflicts. Of course,
Hmm.
there will be conflicts. It's not that we will live in an angelic world, but it won't
Mm-hmm.
be the default. It would be the exception.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the subject of communicating, I'm really a big fan of the poetry that you write on your website. I think it's really fantastic.
Thank you.
I even quoted one of your poems in one of the articles I wrote on my website. I wrote this program called HMS, which is essentially a command line time calculator. You can do calculations with hours and minutes and things like that. I use it to keep track of how long the albums that I make are, the audio file lengths. But there was this wonderful quote you had. I quoted one of your poems, which was on the subject of time. But I'm curious because I also do creative writing myself. On the subject of communicating something, how does the process of writing work for you as a creative outlet, and how do you think about communicating? Because your poetry has a very kind of refined simplicity to it. How do you think about communicating an idea or an inspiration that you get? I get the sense that a lot of your inspiration comes from nature. What is the process like of communicating that in language?
Mm-hmm. The process is it starts from introspection, which is like, well, how do I feel about it? Whatever it is, like, how do I feel about it? And then
Mm-hmm.
is what I have called alla prima. It's a method of trying
Mm-hmm.
to capture the feeling in the moment it happens in
Mm-hmm.
one go. So the
Mm-hmm.
idea is I won't write, let's say, one paragraph today, and then next week another paragraph, and then 1 month later, eventually there will be a publication. No, because
Mm-hmm.
then what happens is I don't have the same emotional state. I
Mm-hmm.
have to disconnect and try to reconnect or recreate it, but then it's fake. I'm not really feeling it anymore. So what I
Mm-hmm.
try to do is it's a little bit like riding the wave if you are doing wave surfing. Well, you
Mm-hmm.
don't have a wave on demand. It's there. It's now or never. That's the idea. So I have this emotional state. I am there. I am surfing on this emotional state, and
Mm-hmm.
now, while I am on this, I want to express it however it comes up. And
Mm-hmm.
then it's like I am not trying to write for an audience. I am
Mm-hmm.
trying to capture that which I feel. And if
Mm-hmm.
there is an audience, well, that's a happy coincidence. And
Mm-hmm.
again, this connects to what we were saying earlier. If I am thinking of, oh, what will the audience say? I have to imagine what is even the audience.
Mm-hmm.
What is their background, who they are, what do they look like. Like I have to make all sorts of assumptions, which ultimately are immaterial. And again, it it impedes the experience of the moment. The experience of the moment is me here feeling this and trying to put that into words.
Interesting.
And of course, you reach a point where it's easier to do it because you do it for long enough where things just flow. But at the beginning, it starts with the ability or the effort, rather, you put into trying to describe what is your immediate reality. Like, I am standing here right now, I am talking, I am feeling a certain way. This is
Mm-hmm.
an interesting discussion, and I have learned
Mm-hmm.
so many things, and the dogs are there, and here is the light, and it's night outside, etc., right? Not to belabor that point, but
Mm-hmm.
the idea is that you start by describing what is the immediate reality, and in
Mm-hmm.
so doing you develop a habit of being able to have situational awareness, and
Mm-hmm.
situational awareness ultimately becomes self-awareness, but
Yeah.
self-awareness not in the negative sense of, oh, I am self-aware and now I am what's
Mm-hmm.
the I am insecure about
Self-conscious.
self-conscious, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
not in that sense, but in the sense of I can communicate what I am experiencing, what I am feeling, and because I understand it, therefore I can talk about it. It's a little bit like you can only teach that which you know well, or you know
Mm-hmm.
well that which you can teach, right? So it's
Yeah.
a little bit
Yeah.
like that. By understanding yourself, by being conscious, mindful of who you are, what your state is, then you are in a position to create based on that.
Yeah. And what you're saying, I try. I think my writing process works in a similar way. It makes me think of a quote from, I can't remember who this is from. It was one of the one of the famous Latin writers. It wasn't Virgil, but it was like that kind of figure. And it was brought up in the context of a discussion I was listening to about about a favorite book of mine, and which is called Ulysses by James Joyce. And the quote is, I forget what the Latin is. It was like rem tene verbum sequentum or something like that. But the translation is grasp the thing and the words will follow. So the idea is that you, and this is what I try to do when I'm trying to describe an inspiration that I had or something, you just focus, you almost, you completely immerse yourself in that emotion. You completely submerge yourself in that feeling. And then you just try to describe what you're seeing, essentially what you're feeling. And then the product of that is basically, because when I'm trying to write, for example, let's say I feel inspired and I try to write a piece about it, or I feel some kind of emotional, complex emotional state, like some kind of state that I'm trying to convey in writing, I want to, exactly like you said, I want to fully explore and understand that state of emotion so that I can communicate it. And this is interesting too, because in one of my favorite writers, Joyce, who I was talking about before, he kind of had this innovative technique where in his book Ulysses, he never describes what the main character looks like. The main character's visual appearance is never described. But there's this funny phenomenon which readers of the book talk about where even though the main character, Leopold Bloom, is never described, people have this very specific sense of what he looks like, even though his description is never given in the book. So there's that's a grasp of the thing idea where Joyce has, through his words, he's communicated this character to such a level of detail that things which even aren't directly literally described by the book are kind of filled in for the reader in their experience of that character, because the grasping it's such a tight grip. And so that's kind of a way, because one of the things I try to do in my writing, in my more artistic writing, is to try to say a lot with very few words, to try to communicate lots of stuff, but in this very short way, or not necessarily short like intentionally brief, but short like efficient. I feel like that's kind of one of the things poetry does, is it uses few words to communicate a very high amount of things. And so that's one of the things I'm interested in too. And I feel like that's one of the things your poem does. Sometimes I've read works of yours which are like 3 lines long, but they send me on an entire journey of thinking about something. And that's one of the things I love about poetry too, is it's a way of workshopping kind of more effective ways to use language in a sense. Because sometimes language can become bogged down by cliches. And I feel like one of the things that creative writers do is they find ways to freshen and to imbue language with new life.
And also part of language, in this case, poetry, is not to describe the truth, but to inspire you to think about, well, what does this mean to you? So ultimately, it's an invitation to create your own world. So here is an input, rather than, well, here is something you just accept it and you don't think about.
Yeah.
And this is also what I like, because another thing I do on my website sometimes is I write interpretations of songs usually. And it's like Greek songs which I translate into English and then I comment on. And what I usually say is that, of course, art doesn't have one truth. There are many truths. And part of this process is to ultimately use this as an inspiration to talk about something that I could have done anyway, but now I have something that focuses my attention. And I'm like, okay, and here it is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And sometimes when you read a really good poem, for example, like each word almost feels like an entire like sentence in and of itself. And it also exposes the musicality of language, which is another thing I'm interested in. Because my interest in music really translates to language as well, because some of the material which has inspired me most to create music has actually just been like poetry of some of my favorite writers, like Wallace Stevens, for example, who has an incredible way of using words in such a way that they're just absolutely bursting with color and just bursting with sensation. And that's what I love about that kind of writing, is just it really elucidates the sensory possibility of language, because there are so many different ways that we communicate. Sometimes we'll be communicating like we'll be texting, or we'll just be talking about something very simple, like, oh, I need this, or you'll be checking out at a grocery store, for example, and you'll say, oh, I need to, can I get paper instead of plastic, or something like that. That's a completely different register of communication than in a poem, for example, where each word matters so much. So it's so amazing talking about consistency. of the world, it's also amazing the flexibility of the different tools that we have. And in a sense, the more abstract a tool is, like language is inherently abstract, the more flexible it is in that sense. And
Yes.
language is easily one of the most flexible tools that we have.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And then also on the point of musicality or of
Hmm.
that aspect of language, again, there are different levels to this where you can have a poem that is really austere and really Spartan, as it were. Like it's
Hmm.
really serious and really brief and doesn't
Hmm.
give you a sense of playfulness.
Hmm.
But that also still has a certain musicality to it, where it's like a more bass kind of sound. It's
Yeah.
not as playful. It's not
Hmm.
as exciting, but it's still
Hmm.
there, and it also
Yeah.
has a role to play. And then, of course, you have the more colorful poems as well, or language in that regard.
Hmm.
And ultimately, we need a little bit of everything.
Hmm.
Because there
Now,
is this
here's.
idea like, oh, we should always do it like this. And then you have something that is formulaic. And
Mhm.
formulaic is another way of saying ultimately it loses its value. It's like, well, we have seen this before. Yeah, that's tired. We need something else. We need variety.
Also, in a sense, wouldn't formulaic also mean that it can be reduced to a formula, i.e., it's not condensed enough. It's not compressed. It doesn't have as much quality per word. Essentially, if something is formulaic, it means it could express it through a short formula, which means it's sort of cruft in a sense. It's like kind of more of that low quality per word type of information.
Yeah, yeah, it's exactly that.
Now, I have a question. I have a question for you regarding your alla prima technique, because this is something I've read about on your website, and now I heard you say it again just a second ago. I wonder, and this is not a criticism, because I feel like your work for me is very obviously well written. But I wonder, in the same way that you work over code for many revisions to create many revisions of packages, have you ever felt inspired to do that with a piece of writing, for example, to write over it for many revisions, create more of this portrait style of more depth, more refinement? Again, not saying your writing isn't refined, because it's very refined, but I wonder, have you ever felt inspired to do that with your pieces of writing, with a poem, with an article, things like that?
The answer is I can't. Or let's say
Mm,
it's very difficult. It's very
mm,
difficult because with code, there is an important distinction, which is first of all, the function is usually self-contained, or anyway, there is a subset of the program that is self-contained. Where to make an edit, I don't need to know every line of code so that I can make that edit. Like I can
yeah,
change, for example, what is the return value without having to also think about what else is the program doing generally. Like there
which
is
is a sign of good code, also.
also, but
Yes.
in a sense here it means that this thing lives in itself. It has a life of its own.
Hmm.
Whereas with a piece of writing, there is an emotional aspect to it, which for me it's very difficult to recreate. At
Mm,
least the kind of writing I do. If I do another kind of writing that it's not riding the wave, as I was explaining earlier, then yes,
hmm.
I will be able to iterate on that because I don't
Hmm.
have this prerequisite of having to connect to a certain emotion, a certain state
Hmm.
of mind. And
Hmm.
of course, that also speaks to maybe an inability to do that. So I'm not saying that,
Mm,
well, I'm not doing it because it's not good. I'm not doing it because maybe I cannot do it. So
mm,
there is that. And maybe I do the alla prima because ultimately that's what worked for me. And it's not like a technique, but rather a technique on top of what is my condition kind of thing.
yeah.
So there is that as well. Uh,
Hmm.
the thing, though, is that there are different kinds of refinement. There is refinement in a piece of work. Like you write something and it's self contained and basically it stands the test of time. And that's
Hmm.
one kind of experience. Like you are talking about Ulysses. So there is this book and you read the book and that's an experience in itself. But then you
Hmm.
can also have an experience which is like you read a series of blog posts.
Hmm.
which now describe a person in a certain state of mind through
Yeah.
certain experiences, which
Yeah.
now is a different view of the world. So if you take that and you reduce that to a book, in a sense, it's a different experience now.
Yeah.
So then we are talking about the different levels of refinement, as it were, or different levels of, well, what are we talking about, or what are we communicating? What are we trying to encapsulate in words? And there is that. And of course, in everything we do, and you say this is not meant as criticism. I think actually that's criticism, I think, is good. Let me say this, because even if you say, look, what you do is not refined enough, I think that's actually good, because if you tell me, of course, why, right? It's good because then you are telling me, well, I care about you, I checked, and this is what I found. So because I care, right? Because otherwise it's not criticism, it's just dismissive, and we call it
Yeah.
criticism, but it's like, oh, I didn't pay attention and I don't like it. That's not
Yeah.
criticism. Criticism is I care because I paid attention, I actually checked, and here it is. So for
Yeah.
me, criticism is good because it gives me insight into something that I may be taking for granted or may not even be noticing. And now I can be introspective, or I can go and revise that, and maybe I will have something better as a result of that. So part of what I do with the alla prima is exactly this, to admit that there is room for growth, because I'm like, look, there are errors here, and many times this is especially true for my videos, where I will make mistakes in language. For example, I will say something like sitting on the table instead of sitting at the table, and when I
Yeah. Yeah.
listen back, I know that I made a mistake, but in the moment I don't realize it. Like, I continue talking, I don't even realize it.
Yeah.
But it's on record. And I don't feel bad about it, because me seeing that is basically me criticizing myself. Like, hey, you made this mistake. And now I am inspired to try and do better next time.
And it's also authentic, right? It's an authentic record of you at that time. It's not edited and things like that.
So it's not ultimately, alla prima is not really a judgment of, well, if you didn't do it in one go, therefore it's not good. It's not that. It's like, this is one way of doing it to communicate one kind of experience that we have in the world, which is the beauty of the moment, if you want to say. But it's not like
Yes.
the only thing we have.
Yeah, and I feel like alla prima can be a good way, talking about sort of writer's block, can be a good way to just get out of it's kind of related to that writing for the wastebasket idea. It's just kind of related to just make something, try to do it right now, because in our lives we have so many things that we need to do that if you say I'm going to do it later, what does that really mean? It might mean that you'll just never even get to it. It's like you're putting it off. It's ontologically demoted to the status of something that might happen instead of something that is happening. So if you want something to be created, then just make sure that its creation is happening by just doing it alla prima, doing it in one go. And then it'll be there, and then you can at least have a record of what you did. Even if you're not completely satisfied with it, you're leaving a paper trail as you progress towards what you're working towards. And that's obviously more useful in a situation where one thing I've done before is I've been trying to, like, there's a situation where I've been trying to create like my next piece of music, for example, and I keep thinking about, well, maybe I'll do it like this, and then I think, well, no, I'm not really. I don't think that would really be the best way. And then later I'm in the shower and I'm thinking, I start thinking, this would be a great way to do it. And then I kind of forget about that idea. And eventually I've been trying to progress I've spent a lot of time working towards this goal, but I don't really have that much of a record of that time. It's just kind of, maybe it's stored in my memory somewhere somehow, but it's not really imminent. I can't really go and look at it. So I like that. I like alla prima for that reason, because obviously you can mix these approaches, right? Let's say you're trying to create something that's very refined and very worked over in a sort of in more of a book sense. You could do a bunch of alla prima sketches, as they're called, and then you could later go back and, from a different kind of mindset, kind of pour that into the mix, that more curator's mindset, and kind of compose those, kind of cut and paste or collage those sketches into something that's more like more concentrated.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And this also ties into what people do, which is, oh, I had this great idea, let me write it down
Yeah.
before I forget. And for me, of course, that's good. If you have a record, that's good. But if you always try to capture what springs to mind, ultimately you are capturing too much. Because, of
Yeah.
course, the mind is like a spring, and you cannot just capture all the water. You just have to let some water flow. So
Yeah.
what I do is, for example, I will go on a walk, and I will
Hmm.
have this idea that I think, oh, it's a good idea. What I
Hmm.
will do is let this idea, occur again, and then I will write about it. Because
Mm.
if it doesn't occur
Yeah.
again, then it doesn't have a sticky quality. Something is not right
Mm.
about it. It's
Yeah.
sort of, it's like a firework. It's impressive, yes, but it won't be here for long. So
Mm.
I'm like, okay, if you show up again, then I will give you my attention, undivided attention. But
Ah.
if you don't show up again, then okay.
I like that idea because it's a filter and it's useful in
Mm-hmm.
that way, but it's not arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely natural in the sense that ideas which recur are, you sort of know that they're stickier, that they're more useful in a sense. So then you only pay attention to those. I like that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then this ties into alla prima in the sense that when you finally commit to doing something, it's something that at one level you know, at another level you are about to discover,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you are sort of working out the details as you go.
Hmm.
And for me, that's fascinating. So it's not like, oh, I just draw without any end goal in mind, without any idea in mind. I draw with a certain idea in mind, but I haven't figured out the details yet, but I will get there, kind of
Hmm.
thing. Or with music, you can think of the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. One of my favorite filmmakers, David Lynch, analogized the nature of having ideas as being kind of like catching fish. Like you're seeing all these fish swim by, and the kind of the longer you let your eyes adjust to the water, the kind of deeper you can see, and then you can see these more kind of glittering, more mystifying fish at the bottom. But ultimately, when you plunge your hand into the water to try to catch something, you can't be constantly doing that, or else you're going to scare away all the fish, right? You have to, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, let the water be still, have a calm mindset where you're perceiving, and then eventually you make a decision. You make this infrequent decision to make a catch. And then once
Mm-hmm.
you have the fish, of course, you don't want to waste it. You want to use the fish.
Yes, yes. Oh, no, that's a very good analogy. Yes. And it's exactly how it is. Like, if you are capturing every idea, it's like trying to go after every fish. It's
Right.
exactly that. So eventually it doesn't work. You won't capture good ideas.
Hmm.
And this is also a problem that connects to the feeling people have of, well, I'm not creative enough, I'm not productive enough, I'm not doing stuff. Well,
Yeah.
part of the problem is because we have great tools to capture everything. You can record an
Mm.
audio, you can write a note, you can have a video of something. Like, we have
Hmm.
all these great tools, but we don't have the training, which is the training of character, as it were. We don't
Hmm.
have the training to know when not to capture, or not to capture early, that sort of
Hmm.
thing. So if we just
Yeah.
capture everything, then we are just overwhelmed.
Right. Exactly. And it feels like it inherently devalues the meaning of each individual artifact because it's just less scarce. It's just surrounded by. It's like looking in your notes app. Like maybe you have 1,000 notes, and one of them's like oh, like make sure to get to my flight on time, and the next one might be something deep, but it doesn't really feel like that because it's amidst this sea of stuff, that's sea of cruft essentially, that's just been captured.
Exactly. So the thoughts that haven't been considered carefully crowd out those that have.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And that's why it's cool to have um, this kind of striation of different spaces where you're like, well, here's my composition notebook, and this one I'll write down ideas which are meaningful to me. But on my phone, I can maybe text out ideas like, oh, make sure to get to the grocery store before 5 p.m. or something like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's how you create a separation between what you may consider like the ephemeral to-dos,
Mm-hmm.
like make sure to be there on time, and
Mm-hmm.
then ideas slash knowledge, that stand the test of time. They don't just live and die in the moment. Like they will be there tomorrow, and then 3 months from now, and 3 years from now, and so on.
Yeah. Like for example, in Emacs, like I'll often write down little transient ideas, like in a scratch buffer, for instance. But then I'll use denote and make a new note whenever I want to write down something important.
Yeah, it's exactly that. But if you are using it to write down everything, then well, how do you retrieve that which has value? How do you find that which has value?
Exactly. Yeah.
Very good. I think we should call it a day because what's the time?
It's
Oh my
2:04 for me, which I think means what time is it for you? Is it 10 p.m. for you?
10, yes.
Okay, 10 p.m. Yeah. Well, this was a wonderful conversation. I think if I remember correctly, we ended up more than doubling the length of our previous one. So
yeah. So when I started doing this, the idea was let's keep it to an hour. Of course, arbitrarily set. I was like, 1 hour should be plenty, right? But then I realized that, well, 1 hour, we didn't even cover the basics. What can you say in 1 hour?
Yeah. Well, I'm so thankful that I got to be a guest again because I think your show is absolutely wonderful, and I've kept up with many of the episodes so far, and I've learned a bunch of things. Just to mention quickly, there was an episode with a guy, I can't remember his name now, but he talked about a note-taking system called a Zettelkasten, and I ended up looking more into that.
Yeah.
Yes, I ended up looking more into that, and I actually use that myself now at this point. I think that's a super useful note-taking system. And I use your, what is it called, denote sequence package to keep track of the Zettelkasten sequence numbers. So yeah, I think this series is super useful, and I hope that somebody who watched this episode, if they made it all the way through, I'm impressed, and I hope they got something out. This was a super fun conversation. Thank you, Prot.
You're welcome, Eric. So I wish you good luck with everything.
Yes,
yeah,
likewise.
Maybe we will have round 3 at some point.
Yes, round 3 at some point. Maybe in the summer we can do round 3. How about that?
Sounds good.
Yes. Okay, awesome.
Very well. So I will now stop recording, and then we call it a day. So actually, let me stop recording and.